A colossal bull monster with a nose ring charged straight at him, and the man snapped his hands up, summoning the holy spirit of flame to give him the flame of wrath, the brutal fire magic of a salamander. He hurled his magic straight at the target, and boom, a massive blast erupted, swallowing the world's greatest wizard Douglas as Balzac rose into view, a thriving city packed with adventurers. People cheered his name as he hauled his cart, loaded up with the monster he just crushed, rolling it straight behind him. Then, somehow, Douglas accidentally became the top wizard in the local guild, and the whole town crowned him the greatest. Back then, he was 100% sure this was the moment he'd keep fighting as an adventurer, and still. At one point, someone told him his adventurer's license was yanked, his card turned useless, and every job was suddenly off limits. 10 years later, Douglas Ford was still stuck with no work. Now he's 37, a middle-aged man with a plan, and he walks into the Balzac Adventurers Guild. Ding, a guild member, steps up to meet him and asks if he's ready to go through the steps to return his license card. But he refused to hand it back. He demanded they rip up the revocation and restore his license instead. The guy got exactly why. I mean, he just bombed 3 rank quests in a row, and after that his guild had zero reason to keep trusting him. He finally got how brutal it was for them. Every adventurer's guild kept its own shared pool of guild points. It's a guild system. Clear the quests they hand you and you both rack up guild points, then use those points for rewards, but one failed quest and the points vanish instantly. And yeah, points matter. If a guild tanks its guild points, the guild masters get demoted, the guild gets shut down, and that disaster can happen fast. And it all started with those quests he took, total dead ends, so his points tanked hard enough that they yanked his license, and nobody saw that coming. 22 years since he'd first set out as an adventurer, and this year, at 37, his whole life finally caved in. His body's falling apart, every stat keeps sliding downhill, but the real nightmare is the strange illness he picked up a year ago. The moment he activates any skill, his max HP gets chopped away. Skills matter a ton for any adventurer, but the max health he drained is gone for good, and the doctor beside him just confirmed it. His body is starting to crack under the strain of using skills. This man was his doctor. He warned him that he'd noticed the same strange symptom in a bunch of people before, and if he kept using those skills, his health would crash to zero and he'd die. Should he quit the road and live like everyone else, or die chasing it like an adventurer? His single mother is already gone, there's no family left to lean on, and since he was 15, he's poured his whole life into this path because he doesn't know anything else. After everything he survived, there's no way he's tossing the life he fought for aside, so he slaps a massive backpack of strange treasures on the table at the guild and demands they let him show it. It was nothing but potions, and he'd bet his life they'd keep him from burning out like last time. The employee nodded like they got it, but Douglas, if his gut was right, was sitting at level 68 right now. But his health won't even crack 2,500. He's basically the same as some level below 10 beginner, and the only way to survive is to team up with a healer, but none have shown up for half a year. Trying to slam into a C-rank quest meant for players around level 30, does he really not see how ridiculous that is? Yeah, he realized it too. But the employee didn't want to spit out that kind of thing. He had something else to tell the hero first, until the guy coming up behind him barked, "Stop." That was all it took. The guild master swept up to them, and Douglas felt the weight lift off his chest until the master's face told a different story. Douglas said he had a request for him, and knowing Douglas, he was sure it wouldn't get refused, but the look on the guild master's face screamed trouble. He told Douglas to stop, and he knew Douglas hated turning small things into big disasters too. All around them, people were whispering, calling him an old man, muttering that he never shut up. Word had already spread that his license got yanked. They mocked him to his face, but the master snapped that they owed Douglas too. Once he'd been the guild's pride, and they'd never erase what he'd done. So they refused to let him die for nothing. They needed him to get one last truth. He had no choice but to bolt, then slid down to the building's entrance, let out a heavy sigh, and finally faced the truth. It was time to take control and handle everything himself. Now he's got no top-tier gear and barely any money. His license is gone, his bills are eating him alive, and the city won't wait, so he needs to face the truth, pack his stuff, and get ready to leave. He looked up, and there they were, 4 heroes riding in to meet him. The same team he'd been kicked out of 6 months ago. Budu stood there, almost 20 years younger, and they'd leveled up fast enough to blow his mind, traveling together like they never missed a beat. The moment he stepped out of this town, he knew he'd never see them again, like fate had already sealed it. He strode up to the boys, greeted them with a grin, and asked how long it really had been since they last saw each other. Alan, the warrior, and Fanny, the healer, were the first to rush up and greet him. Then Fanny smiled and said it had been ages, and that running into him in this city was pure, unbelievable luck. Out of the corner of his eye, he swore it wasn't luck, this man had ambushed them. Edmund the Sage, the name hit like a hammer. He insisted that even if Douglas begged 100 times, the answer wouldn't change, they couldn't take him back. He demanded that the people he'd been tormenting look through his eyes, and the hero snapped back that he was dead wrong. Funny thing is, the very same guy had already shown up to them before, right after his exile, begging them to change their minds. But he definitely didn't follow, because at that moment, persistence had taken over his whole soul. He admits it. He chose to go straight to the guys and tell them the truth. He was leaving the city today. While he was getting ready, he suddenly stumbled into them by accident, and he decided to squeeze in one last goodbye. Fanny was shocked, and the sage only smiled. He fired off a sarcastic remark, saying he couldn't believe there was some city where adventurers could live even easier than here, so why would that guy leave? The hero rubbed the back of his cheek, completely clueless on how to answer. Right then, Dario, the team's swordsman, burst out from the side, leaped into the scene, and started mocking Edmund, calling out how cruel that answer sounded. He asked the old man if he was on board and pointed out the license was already yanked, so what was that big pile of baggage doing there? What was he even going to do next? Sell potions? Because right now, he was buried at rock bottom. Another blunder because he was going to die for sure. The sage let out a cruel laugh like it sparked a memory, then leaned in and asked how much Alan's health had dropped since that moment. Alan, right behind him, burst out in a full-throated scream, "Stop!" And yeah, it was insane. He just keeps snapping, "Stop wasting your time." But when he begs old Douglas for forgiveness, everyone's already in a rush, so he has no choice but to bolt. Then the hero stammers, spiraling into an apology to the boys for tying them up with all that chatter. He waved goodbye to the girl and she nodded right back. Then the shock hit. Even as a hero, Alan never once let his feelings show, so could this be his way of standing up for him? As long as he's on the road, he'll keep wishing them the best. 3 months have already shattered since he left Balzac, and he's still dragging himself through this pointless trip. Now he grabs whatever work he can find that doesn't need a license, pockets enough to keep moving, and then barrels into the next city day after day after day. When he hit 15, he threw himself into adventuring for humanity, determined to do something good no matter what his mother tried to stop. And the crazy part was, this drive only pushed him further. Before, if a fight even hinted at death, he'd go in ruthless and grin while it all crumbled around him. And even as his health started to drop, he still kept blasting his skills. But now fear of death grips him for real. He's already lost his license, and even the pride he fought to protect at the cost of his life is slipping away, yet somehow he still refuses to let go of life. But now he's stranded, wallowing in self-pity, stumbling through the thick forest until he finally realizes night has swallowed everything. Then, right behind him, a shadow keeps moving, heading the opposite way. If he could break free from this cursed forest, a border checkpoint waited ahead. But at night, the woods were packed with dangers, and he'd have to reach it before it closed, or he'd be in real trouble. Suddenly, that sharp stink of blood hit his nose, and he charged through the bushes straight toward it. Ahead, a massive wolf-shaped monster slammed onto the ground, staring him down in silence, then let out a heavy, painful breath. Fenrir stared back at her and she didn't even blink. After 3 brutal years since the Demon King's revival, demons and monsters stopped being background noise and started threatening humanity's survival. Fenrir was a rare sight even for demons. When it finally slipped into human lands, it should have been a myth, but there it was, sprawled right in front of him, bleeding out like a hunter had just caught and mauled it. The man strode straight at the monster, even as he called himself a demon too. He didn't want to slaughter it for no reason, he just wanted to save it if he could, but he couldn't make that happen. Then, snap, the demon rose onto its front paws, locked onto him, and snarled with bared teeth. Terror seized the man's chest. He got that his fear was real, but he promised he wouldn't hurt him. Then he spotted a magic circle etched into the demon's stomach, a cursed seal, and his mind reeled at how he'd been dragged under that curse. Curses are forbidden skills, deadly moves meant to crush your enemy with pure suffering. Each cursed seal hits a different way, and then there's the worst one of all, the curse of reincarnation. A man is trapped inside this Fenrir and he wastes no time. He blurts out the truth about it, a curse that turns a man into a beast. The moment he asks, the demon's eyes start to well up. He can't wrap his head around why anyone would do something like this, and at this point the reason doesn't even matter, because at this pace, this man's going to die. Either way, he has to break this curse. Douglas yanked off his backpack, slammed it to the ground, and charged straight for the monster. He'd faced curses before and wiped them away more than once, and even if his power wasn't what it used to be, the technique and the knowledge were still locked in his bones. He couldn't forget what the doctor warned, keep pushing, and if his health ever hit zero, he'd drop dead. He snapped back to the truth. His strength was never the same as before, and spell to spell was brutal enough to end his already crumbling HP. So this felt like the final time he'd save someone as an adventurer. But when you really think about it, disappearing like that isn't the worst thing. He straight up told the demon he'd lift the spell now, then ordered her to behave, and the monster wailed across the whole area until the magician snapped at her to not be scared. He swore he'd heal her, no excuses, no escape, because he wanted to do right, even if it meant living for someone else at last, not drifting through some futile, aimless existence, but spending his life worthily one final time. He started chanting, begging the shimmering particles and hope to gather right here, then he barked the spell to be dispelled, because he knew his power would drain and his health would vanish. A searing pain already gutted him, but he pushed through and finished the chant. He can only pray her wounds mend too, but the magic slammed him into the nearest tree. Then he blinked awake. Stunned, he was still alive, and he couldn't wrap his head around how any of it even happened. This wasn't a dream because the seal was still burning with power, and what was happening didn't make sense to him at all. He snapped open his status window fast. It revealed his identity: Douglas Ford, human, unemployed, level 68, with 60,900 health and 510,432 mana. His health score hit 60,900 and he nearly choked on the shock. He was 100% sure it was just 2,000 red last time, so how did his status crash back to those old readings? The spell finally finished, but the seal wouldn't budge and the skill just bounced right back, doing absolutely nothing. He's just guessing, but it sure looks like that skill caught and struck him, because instead of dropping dead from health depletion, he actually bounced back, returning to his old stats. So yeah, turns out he got cursed too, and now it all clicks. He starts thinking his condition isn't some random nightmare at all, but plain old aging or some rare disease, and if that's true, then once the skill hit him back, it would have vanished the moment it bounced. Just picture this, he never even felt the curse latch onto him, like he's completely oblivious. And honestly, that's the kind of mistake that screams idiot, because it should have shown up as a status ailment already. So where the hell is everyone else's notice? And the big question hits next, who even planted that curse on him? Yeah, he'd deal with that later. Right now, the demon had him in its sights and the bleeding wouldn't quit, so he had to act fast or this was going to end in disaster. When her dispel spell got bounced back, it was proof. Someone hit her with a forbidden curse, one of the deadliest on the board, and only the caster can undo it. So yeah, he can undo this Fenrir curse and crawl back into being human. But think about it. If only the person who put the curse on him can break it, then all he has to do is become the one who cursed him, right? The monster stared at him like he'd spotted something off, and when he started falling behind Alan and the others, he panicked, then threw himself into studying every last skill detail, desperate to catch up. If he's got that one copy skill that lets him switch his voice and look into someone he knows, he can use it to wear the exact face of the one who cast the curse. He'd love to claim that's the case, but he has no clue who this guy is, so he has to dig into his memories and use the right wolf skill to trade information. Once he's got the caster figured out, he'll rip off his old look, shift into that form, and break the curse from the inside. At least that's the theory. But in the same breath, he'll need to lean on special skills or fall back on the second method, because only one person on this earth has ever mastered it. And that's when Alan became a real hero, because his wild gift let him use skills in parallel. The king saw it, handed him the heroic title, and made his fame official. Now with his powers back, how would Tony even react? He had to find out fast. He dropped into casting the Soulmind Gate spell, begging it to open and fuse with him. Then he hit the memory swap. He pressed his hand to the huge demon's forehead, and boom, memories of that terrified girl who fled from some strange man slammed into his mind, showing him exactly what the caster was like and what he looked like. Alright, now he has to use the form, no panic. Even if he stacks a few skills, his health won't drop like before. He's got this. He kicks off the spell to crank up the plain common sense hidden behind the form, then orders himself to imitate. He slipped into the exact same man who had bewitched the girl, but he knew the spell wouldn't last, so he fired off faster imitations and quicker dispersals, scooping up shards of hope right now, then swaying everything in its wake. Break the unique spell and boom, fierce gusts of wind whip through the whole area. The spell collapses and right in front of him sits a tiny little girl who hasn't been a demon for long. She's so young, and when she turns around, she's completely naked. He lent her your coat, and once he saw she was okay, relief hit hard. Then he asked if her voice was coming back, if she could speak. She managed it, but only slowly, and they just stared at each other in silence. He was totally baffled because she barely spoke at all, and he had zero clue how to act around kids her age. What a disaster of a first step. He had to do something. He devoured the magnanimous goddess's spells to bless himself as the protector of life. Then he healed the girl completely, restoring her to full health before asking if any pain lingered, and she told him she was okay now. She was healed by Mr. Great Magician, so don't worry, she's fine now, and he even admitted, "I'm not some great magician, I'm just a friendly middle-aged neighbor." Later, they huddled by the fire cooking up food, and the man suddenly paused. He hadn't even introduced himself yet. "I'm Douglas Ford," he said, then smiled and added, "and her name is Ravi." He asked if she remembered the city she called home, telling her he could walk her back at dawn, yet she went quiet at first, then admitted she had nowhere else to go, so he pressed for answers. What happened to her family and why? She wasn't spared either. No family, no home, so now she's stranded all by herself, but the curse didn't erase her whole past, right? As the girl spiraled into panic, she screamed that she didn't want to return anywhere, ever. Shock hit him and she trembled with pure fear. What the hell just happened to her? If she didn't want it, he wouldn't drag her there, he'd promised that, but right now he was completely lost. She's got her reasons, and dumping her in the nearest town would be a disaster, but he's got acquaintances, so it's not hopeless. He admitted it's a haul, though. There's a town called Baltzak. He'll hunt for someone to watch over her, even if it's a long road, and he's praying she won't mind. So when she asks if it'll be hard for him, he says, "Of course not," and flashes a smile right at her. The food finally hit the table, but one last dish still needed cooking, and the girl had something she wanted to say. Only the man didn't hear her, so he asked again, and she immediately snapped her head away, mortified, refusing to speak a word. The man sliced apples thin on a board, then fried each batch separately until the edges turned soft and tender on both sides. Then he handed the plate to the girl, smiling as he wished her a delicious meal. For dinner, they served bread piled with apples and a steaming pork soup that smelled sweet as candy, and she had to watch her step because it was scorching. So when she took the first bite, joy exploded, and she kicked her legs like she couldn't stop smiling. He couldn't stop smiling because she was smiling too. Turns out the fire sparked a weird little mix of bittersweet apples and dry bread, and if you've got dried pork, you can also whip up a rich dashi broth. Cook it until the meat starts sweating out fat and turns tender, because once it hits that point, it's pure heaven. Robbie was trembling from head to toe, and the man snapped, "What's wrong with you?" Was she just being picky, or was something underneath the surface hurting her? Then it hit. Everything was just so incredible. With tears spilling down her face, she thanked him for saving her, and he realized he didn't just want to survive anymore. He wanted to live for her and do good. But what survived the chaos was a middle-aged man and a mysterious girl named Ravi. And now he has to tell her the same story because their brief, dangerous journey kicks off right here. Ravi was passed out on the bedclothes on the ground when she snapped her eyes open. Then the man noticed and grinned, saying good morning and asking if she'd slept well. Ravi apologized, embarrassed that she dozed off while he'd been standing watch over her. But he had no clue what she meant. People always say kids grow while they sleep, and she insists she needs it. Still, before the move, they had to pull off one thing first. He stitched homemade shoes for the girl out of bags. She gasped as the bags magically turned into shoes. He'd only tied them up with string and they looked awful at first, so she forced herself to wait a bit longer. Then she smiled and told him, "No way, this isn't the end. I'll take care of them," and she thanked him. She's a total good girl, perfect. Now that everything's ready, it's time to move out. He called Ravi, who sat with his back to him, and when he checked what she'd done, she'd spotted something on the ground, shiny, shimmering, like it was begging to be discovered. He asked if she remembered anything about that necklace, and she shook her head like it didn't mean a thing. Then he just couldn't wrap his mind around how something like this could vanish and sink so deep in the mountains. With those special devices turned on, spells and magical skills hit way harder. So yeah, there's a strong chance this was used to put a curse on Ravi. He thrust it toward her and asked if she wanted to wear it, because the curse was already broken, it was safe. But she refused, knowing that if she kept it, she'd have to sell it in town, so for now, he would hang on to it. It's not a long trip with good company. Now they're pushed into the northern stretch of the Kingdom of Laos, and since Baltzak's metropolis sits in the southwest, they're heading south for it. This stretch of the region is pure untouched wilderness, no roads, no settlements, nothing but dark, wild forests, so only traveling merchants dare to pass through, and you won't find a single carriage rolling along the main roads. He figured staying silent would kill the vibe, so he talked up a storm on the way, awkward and clumsy, sure, but he kept going anyway, and Ravi leaned in and listened like it was gold, totally hooked by every tale from his old travels. They just met, and yet something feels off in him already, like he's not the same guy who used to drift around the world with no direction. And yeah, people say there's no long way when you're with good company, but this time, the company feels better than anything. After what felt like forever, they finally arrived, McFadden's tiny village, where the hotel is stitched together with a small shop and even a church in the northern corner, and he'd already slept there the night before. He burst into the building and greeted the owner, then asked for 2 sets of clothes, shoes, and underwear for the girl, plus soup and towels. The owner told him to step inside and wait a minute while she hurriedly got everything ready. Even though she was his daughter, he bit his tongue and said nothing. Her shoes were stitched from wood and leather, and she asked which pair they liked. The man shot back with one question: what kind wouldn't bite or hurt after you wore them for a long time? Wooden ones felt way more comfortable, sure, they'll shrug off moisture and handle water and cold better than leather, so she's convinced they'll suit her. And since kids shoot up fast, she picked underwear 1 size bigger. Then she asked if they needed anything else, and the man tried to get his hands on that leather flask too, but it was sold out, so he promised to hunt it down in the nearest town. An old man caught their words mid-sentence and shot a question back. "Are you headed to Addington?" He smiled and said he ran a tiny shop there, like, "Come meet me there." He usually tests and evaluates every item people bring him, using his skills like a weapon. But he can't stand being stuck in the shop all day, so he hands it all to his son and heads out to trade small stuff. The man was all in on the appraisal, so he yanked out the necklace they'd just found and asked the old man what he thought it could sell for. The old man pushed up his glasses and said it looked like a true antique. He needs just 1 shot to lean on his appraisal skills, because the mistress flat out said Grandpa Theo's talent isn't required and that he can appraise just fine without it. Then they pressed the necklace up to the lens and inspect it. It was a black pearl, and she figured the market would pay around 20 silver for it, and if they wanted it, she'd sell to them. 20 silver might not sound huge, but it was solid money, enough to cover a full month's worth of food. That black pearl was a steal for the price, until you learned it was already soaked in a forbidden spell, because gemstone magic hits way harder than anything ordinary, and this wasn't just some regular black pearl. Turns out it's a black obsidian pearl, looks like the other one, sure, but the price is wildly different. This is pure treasure, and the only way to get it is by harvesting the eyes from a rare black tiger shrimp. She stared in disbelief at the black tiger shrimp's eye in front of her, and the old man snapped that she couldn't afford it since she had no skills, so she couldn't even name a normal price for the product. Douglas shot up and started his incantation, begging the almighty God to flip open the book of knowledge and hand him the sharp mind of an appraising judge. Then he used his skill and knew for sure. It was a black obsidian pearl. Shock hit the woman and the old man so hard they practically blew steam, screaming at the top of their lungs, begging him to use the appraisal skill. The old man assumed they were travelers, but nope, turns out they were merchants. He hurried to reassure them they were just plain wanderers, but once they saw his moves, it was obvious he wasn't ordinary at all. The women were yelling, and honestly, who would? Because here he was with serious skills and he wasn't even a merchant. Grandfather said that top-tier adventurers could absolutely snag real skills, so if that's true, then yeah, he'd basically be calling himself a high-level skill user. But the hero shot back, basically saying, if we're being real, I'm not some top-tier adventurer. He still had appraisal skills and knew the prices, so he apologized, worried we'd feel weird because of him. The old man burst into laughter, bragging that he'd been totally taken in by his humble act, while the landlady shot back that, sure, he wasn't a merchant, but with that sharp eye for value, he might as well have been family. Right then, they had barely anything on hand. But if he swung by the old man's shop in Addington, he'd get it for at least market value, and the old guy, Theo, even gave his name, so he was already counting down to their next meeting. Later, they slipped into another shop, and the owner greeted them with a bright smile, because she'd totally remembered him from just a bit ago and asked if he'd stay the night, and now, the moment she looked at him, she knew something big had gone down. The woman spotted the little girl and demanded, "Who are you?" Because the last time she wasn't with him, and the man didn't even know what to say. She eyed him like something was off, saying he didn't look like a kidnapper, so she wouldn't stick her nose into trouble that wasn't hers. Yet if that kid was still in the bed, she'd treat it just like an adult, and the man nodded along, agreeing. Hey, she's filthy, so the mistress won't let her sleep like that. She orders a full scrub, then drags the tub out back to wash her before she can go inside. The man hauled a bucket of water, and now that he finally had skills, he didn't need to scramble for it anymore. He could hold back and ration his strength. He begged the Holy Spirit of Water, the one hunting for the love of lonely souls, to pour him blessed water, the magic of Undine, and when he reached Kurita, where the girl scrubbed her clothes, massive magic spheres started popping into existence. She stared at the picture in pure shock, because that kind of amazement wasn't enough. Only after he got his powers back, just like before, did he finally realize what it truly felt like. He demanded to know what was wrong, and Robbie snapped that, wait, she just spotted something tucked beside the necklace, but he wasn't supposed to hear it yet. Then she even asked if she could sell that too, because it was a gorgeous ring. He couldn't forget it. Alan's parents were slaughtered right before his eyes when he was just a kid, and rage pushed him toward revenge. He vowed it all on the ring his mother left him, and that's exactly why he showed him the same ring back then. There was no way this was a mistake. The dragon ruby was a treasured piece of his parents' past, and he knew it was meant to mean everything to him, but he couldn't remember his parents ever handing him that ring, and it definitely shouldn't have accidentally ended up in his luggage. So then why in the world was it waiting for him out there in the mountains? Even though he knows the reason, he just can't bring himself to accept it. Then, after that brutal hit from the spell to spell, the cursed accessory clinging to Ravi and the ring, his old strength surges back, and the worst part is this. The one who cast the curse was Alan. Alan comes off as totally creepy, and what's worse, he still stood up for him back then, even as the loss of his license sealed his fate and he just waited for death, because his so-called former comrade had doomed him to it. As he grappled with his thoughts, the magic fizzled out, then the water drops exploded into a full downpour, drenching Ravi and the other man to the bone. He couldn't even figure out what he'd done to set him off like this, and still nothing clicked in his head. Turns out that was the whole problem. He must have been acting indifferent and never even caught that someone was offended. Rafi plopped down in the wet, and while she stared at him, soaking through, she asked what the hell was wrong, yet the guy brushed her off, insisting it wasn't anything special. For her, it meant nothing, but the truth was blazing in his face. He didn't deny it, because Ravi could read feelings like a book, and at that point, there was no use pretending anymore. He dropped to the ground and told Ravi to listen, because that ring she found wasn't just something valuable. It once mattered to one of his old comrades, and they weren't selling it. They were going to return it to its rightful owner and finally uncover why he'd thrown it away. The owner stormed into the yard and demanded why both of them were sitting there drenched, so she grabbed the kid and decided to bathe him herself, while he had to go get cleaned up. The man insisted he could handle it solo, but the woman cut him off hard, saying he needed to show her respect just because she was a girl, and when he finally understood his mistake, he turned and walked away. He figured it was normal not to stress over stuff like that since she was still just a kid, even if she was a stranger, but she nailed the truth. The man was shaving his beard with a knife, and he clearly had no clue what he was doing. A shout snapped him around, and there she was, the owner, already back with the kid who'd been washed, grilling him about what he thought of Robbie's freshly trimmed bangs. They were too long, so she cut them down with permission, right there. The girl couldn't stop smiling, while the hostess kept waving him over like, come on, say something. He took a good look. She was surprisingly kind for a kid. They slipped inside and sank into their seats at the table, and the hostess started serving the dishes one by one. And she said, sure, yet she couldn't stop asking herself why he'd come back to this tiny village again. Didn't he go on a journey to pick up his daughter? She asked Ravi, because he had to be having the best time traveling with his dad. But when she heard what they said about her father, her face fell. She stared at her plate and couldn't hide how shattered she was, and the words she'd said earlier hit him again. She had no family. She must miss him more than anything, or maybe he was already gone to the next world. He hasn't gotten curious or asked about it yet, because he's sure she doesn't want to talk, but even if they split up, they'll still be stuck traveling for months in Baltzak. It'd be a pretty lonely story since they were total strangers. He didn't even know how much space he needed to keep from her, but he could make it work as long as he inched closer to her, step by step. He stared at his handful of coins, every last bit of money he had left, and knew he'd have to land a permanent job soon. Then the kid grinned and thanked him for the food, saying it was so tasty. He couldn't believe how fast she devoured her food, and now it hit him, she'd need a little rest and a hotel stop. So he called the girl staring out the window, and she gasped as she spotted a massive house sitting at the far end of the settlement. 5 days flew by since they'd blasted out of McFadden Village, and finally Theo and Robbie rolled into Addington, the charity town where Theo's grandpa runs his shop, sitting on soft, gently sloping land. And up on the high ground on the northern shore sits the Matlock Orphanage. Big city orphanages are common, but most of them are struggling hard with money. So yeah, practically none of them can even come close in elegance, and that's exactly why the city shelters still look respectable. Then the place's owner strides up and asks, "So, you guys traveling through?" She caught their attention on the building and lit up, calling it a wonderful orphanage, then added that the director used to be a big success in trade and now poured his money into giving orphans a real education. Honestly, what people came up with is wild, and yeah, this is the 4th time he's heard a story just like this. He walks into any place and somehow only gets good news about his reputation. I think he should make sure Ravi doesn't feel trapped by him, because they pushed forward down the street past the rolling carriages, and the man could tell she was watching them closely. He leaned in and asked if she'd ever ridden them, but she shook her head. No chance yet. He said if they went a little farther south, they'd spot stagecoaches. Sooner or later, he promised, he'd give her a ride. Those stagecoaches were big multi-seat, horse-drawn carriages that hauled everyday people and mail. Now he keeps catching her grin, and he swears it's the short bangs doing it. He watched the man slip out of the building while the kids nearby swarmed the principal, shouting thanks for sweets. Then he hurried over, waving it off like it wasn't a big deal, and told everyone to watch their step. He zeroed in on this guy. Could he be the director of the city orphanage? And were these kids nearby dressed like they belonged to some noble household? Compared to them, the clothes Ravi bought were way too plain, and he couldn't help it. His eyes flicked to the girl, whose face screamed a completely different mood than the joy she had when she'd heard about the carriages. People get that look when they're dying to have something, and yeah, she's probably insanely jealous of those adorable outfits. Right then, the kids who'd just been chatting with the principal came sprinting straight for her, and the man barked at her. The girls spotted they were barreling straight at her, then their feet tangled and they crumpled backward, just as the principal and Douglas snapped in, catching their kids at the last second, and somehow everything turned out okay. Douglas stared at Ravi, asking if she was alright, then the director pressed on, checking on his own kids, before turning to the magician and begging forgiveness for the sake of his children. The hero admitted he wasn't paying attention and asked Raffi if she could stand up. Then the announcer snapped into it when he noticed them and told the hero he should apologize, because it turned out he jumped to conclusions, assuming the two were father and daughter. But the man couldn't figure out why it felt so clear to him, and then it hit. Every step they keep apart is the reason. Even when he reached out, that girl froze, refusing to take his hand. If those two were truly father and daughter, this never would have happened, and the explanation was crystal clear until the director leaned in and asked what kind of relationship they had. Douglas suddenly feared they'd think he was kidnapping children, so he rushed to explain that they were just father and daughter out of duty, and that this was only recently. The announcer swore that this case had blown his life wide open. The hero snapped that he already had enough worries to deal with and somehow kept it together. Then the director pressed him, "So what worries are you talking about? There's no way he's trying to court a little girl who isn't even related to him by blood." Then the hero snapped to it, realizing he just said way too much. Then the director blurted out exactly what he thought. Yeah, maybe it was rude, but it also felt like those two were already in hot water. He runs the orphanage here in Matlock, and he wanted to offer advice if the guy would even let him. It's brutal trying to take care of a little girl. Every trip slows down. He can't just zoom off, and he can't ignore her while she sleeps either, so he figures he really was on guard all night. And most of all, he's convinced they'll burn through more money than he ever did when he was alone, because now he's got a bunch of kids shoved into his care from all kinds of messes. The man catches the hint instantly, but he refuses to go along with it. Instead, he pushes one solution hard: leave Ravi in an orphanage. Why did it end like that? The man yells, "I'm grateful for your offer," then grabs the girl and bolts, while the director, watching from the sidelines, is left completely stunned. They finally burst into the hotel, and the girl sank onto the edge of the bed in total silence. Since they came back, Ravi didn't feel like herself. She just stared at her clothes, mute and frozen, comparing them piece by piece with what the kids from the orphanage were wearing. The girl called Douglas clutched her shirt and asked if it was expensive, and the man scratched his face and blurted that it was cheap. then apologized, cheeks burning with shame, while the girl smiled and said she was relieved it was. He couldn't figure it out. Why was she glowing like that? Was Ravi fretting over something besides her clothes, or was she quietly lost in thoughts of him? And then, how could she not be bursting with envy? He nearly forgot he'd run off just because the director told him to, but then he couldn't stop wondering what Robbie was thinking. Surely, with all those kids her age around, she could make it through without feeling even a bit uncomfortable. This can't be real. Did Robbie actually want to go to the orphanage after what he asked her? If that's true, then he's about to apologize for snapping at the director without thinking. And right now, the girl's face is frozen in pure shock. He could have asked him tomorrow to finally get the truth about how she felt, but when he pressed, she shook her head hard, then she shut it down completely. He let out a huge sigh of relief, yanked the door open, told her he'd be right back, and ordered her to wait, then he bolted out. It was a relief to have things under control, but she didn't look like she wanted a shelter, and if she ended up going anyway, he was determined to get her dressed up nicely first. If she keeps acting like this, she'll be miserable no matter where they go. He only scraped together a small gift, but he's praying it brings her at least a little happiness. He burst into the hotel, bracing himself with "I'm sorry for everything," then looked around. She wasn't there. On the table, a note waited for him. He snatched it up and demanded answers, and the words inside hit hard. She thanked him for everything. And somehow, even without her there, her happiness felt like it was right beside him. She rushed to the shelter while the man immediately lunged for the door, having zero clue how to raise kids and already plotting to dump Ravi with one of his friends. If he was just chasing a life with zero hassles, the place wouldn't even matter. So he told Ravi he wanted to hear how she felt. Then the moment she answered, he deliberately looked away and bolted like he couldn't face her. He shouldn't follow her. Then it all snapped into focus. The gift he'd bought had slipped from his hands and was already wrecked, and not long after that, he marched into Theo's department store. He stared through the glass door as his son shoved the inventory into his father's hands and demanded, "Leave it to me, I'm strong enough." Then the old man he already knew shot back that this kid was far stronger than his sickly, fragile son. The hero stepped into the shop, and the moment he did, an old man's eyes lit up, finally recognizing him and grinning like he'd been waiting for him to show. "So you came to give me back that necklace, huh?" he asked, and then the smile vanished because the real problem was already there. This necklace used to belong to a kid he used to run around with, so he's telling himself he'll return it one day. He feels awful about it, but he also knows he'll never get the chance to sell it to that old man. Theo didn't get where this was going, so he cut the conversation short. He was still locked in on one thing: what happened to the girl who owned that necklace, so the man laid out everything that had happened during that time. After he finally heard the whole story, the merchant's son lit up and said it was amazing. Then he leaned in with confidence and swore the girl was incredibly lucky because happiness was coming for her. The man finally got it. Theo was right, because Theo straight up said he didn't like him, and who ever heard of a merchant who didn't tightly cling to every coin? Then his son snapped again, adding his father's words to the pile and telling the hero to ignore him. His father is basically the only one in this town who trash talks the director, saying she made the perfect choice when she trusted her, because even when they're hunting for adoptive parents, he won't accept anyone who isn't a nobleman, and yeah, lots of kids have already broken free from her nest. This city already feels comfy enough to live in, and they still walk out. That's what makes it weird. Sure, this is a massive big city, but don't people say the eastern continent is on a whole other level? He has to understand if he heads southeast from here, he'll hit the port, and once he's there, he can cross the ocean, and that's when the man pressed him, asking if cross the ocean meant the port town of Shipton. But Shipton only lets in tiny short-haul fishing boats and merchant ships. He's tangled with the guild enough times that he's almost certain not a single passenger ship has dared to stop here in years. 10 years back, the eastern continent got slammed by brutal invasions from the Demon King, and the demons' cruelty never let up. This is what they told him as he headed east from Shipton to wipe them out. And yeah, he remembers it all too well. When the director came back on a merchant ship with his crew, he basically became unstoppable. He could call a ship anytime he wanted. So yeah, the man was terrified because escaping was impossible. Alan's squad probably grabbed the eastern continent for now, but this city is in danger all over again. Because look, this merchant doesn't seem to know a thing about the Demon King's invasions. So are they really sending the kids away without the director even realizing what's coming? But the one who drops off the kids always makes it safely to the eastern port, so if the director doesn't know, then he's clearly the one keeping them hidden. But why, exactly? He couldn't stand to leave Ravi there, so he swallowed his apology, blurted "I'm sorry," and bolted out of the shop, right as the old man's son demanded what happened, and he snapped back that he was going to bring Ravi back. A little later, he came barreling toward the shelter and pounded on the door, gasping from the long run, and the door swung open, right in front of him, where the director stood, staring at that all-too-familiar face and asking what in the world he wanted. The man said he'd come to pick up Ravi, and the director just stared. Why would he pick her up? Did Ravi want to come herself? He knew she'd told him all about it yesterday, so this had to be nothing more than a misunderstanding. He grabs Ravi and decides he's going to find her, then tells everyone it sounds promising. She'll probably be in the garden with the other kids. He promises to lead the way, and sure enough, the garden is packed with children. The heroes turn their heads and scan the whole place, hunting for Ravi. Seeing her, he roared her name and sprinted over, only for her to demand why he'd come. He insisted he was here for her and that they could finally head home, and the girl lit up, then something halted her in mid-reach. The girl shot back that if she stayed with him, he'd be the one drowning in trouble, so she wanted to stay here. And just then, it hit him again. That moment the principal told him it couldn't be easy to take care of a little girl. Traveling with a baby slams the brakes on how far you can go, and there's no zoning out while it sleeps. You can't just ignore it because he's convinced the baby's keeping watch. He was so swallowed up in his own head that he totally forgot Ravi was there, listening from behind like a silent witness. Then he dropped the real bomb. They'd rack up even more expenses than when they were alone, and Ravi caught every word. With her quiet, guarded vibe, he should have read the truth from the start, like she was silently convinced that being around him would only weigh him down time and again, and it finally hit him right now. He dropped to his knees and begged her to forgive him. He'd never really taken her feelings seriously, and he'd even messed up by misunderstanding her and storming out. Still, he asked for forgiveness, and she told him flat out that he didn't need to apologize. But he never once thought Ravi would become a burden. No, he'd be thrilled if they could travel together again. So he asked her once more, "Come back with me." With her palms clenched in her clothes, she blurted, "Am I really not a burden?" When he shook his head, she didn't hesitate. She lunged straight into his arms because she genuinely didn't want to go, and then the tears just poured as she held him tight. The director rushed up and clapped, declaring it was wonderful. Then tears welled in his eyes because he was so moved. He'd want to help so many people, but she was already determined to leave, and that meant he could only see her off. The man blurted that before he even left, he had to ask Principal Matlock one thing. He'd heard every kid from the orphanage was getting shipped to the eastern continent. But wait, didn't that mean crossing the ocean? The director swore it was true, so he still sometimes escorts them off and then heads to the eastern continent to check himself. Though it's brutal to visit so often, the last time he made it there was a year ago. Douglas asked what he was really getting from it, said the place sounded great. The director shrugged and swore it was full of life, day after day buzzing with a festive vibe, and the kids who just moved in looked happier than anyone could imagine. You see, that's why he hadn't been fooled back then. 3 long years later, the Eastern Continent was once again getting hammered by the 4 Heavenly Lords and the Demon Lord. They've got the industrial city of Bourbon locked under their control, yet he insists the people there looked shockingly happy, like they'd never want to leave. Most travelers can't even reach that place, and if someone miraculously slips into the city by pure luck, they're trapped there with no way out. The director wipes the sweat off his face with a handkerchief, tells everyone to keep their voices down because it can't be helped, and swears he watched the whole thing firsthand. Then Douglas fires back, saying, "So did I," and calls it strange all over again. The director called the kids into the house for a bit, and every last one of them obeyed and slipped inside, like he planned to pull them out if things got ugly. Even though nobody could follow his logic, there was no reason to show off his favorite product. He'd just have to kill him. With a sharp wave of his hand, people surged in from every side clutching weapons. Turns out they were the shelter workers who'd been involved too, and as he guided Ravi behind his back, he leaned in to tell her, "Remember this. No matter what comes, he'll shield her with everything he's got." Then the director roared an order to kill the man with the child, and right then the hero snapped into action, chanting the spell and begging the goddess guardian of the sacred land to seal it with a chilling kiss. Hell's ice magic tore through the air, and when he slammed the ground, frost exploded outward, turning everything in sight to ice and freezing even the people standing nearby. At last, the director snapped to the truth. This wasn't defense at all, he was an offensive skill user. Douglas told Ravi to wait at the spot, then stormed to the director and demanded answers about where the kids who escaped the orphanage went, only for the director to shrug and claim he had no clue, while the magician casually turned his own body to ice, setting up a freezing death. The director snapped with a scream. Was he really trying to scare him or just bluffing? His face didn't look like a killer's, not at all. But then the magician's smile twisted into something sinister, and that creepy grin made my skin crawl. Turns out he'd only copied the director's face. Simple, right? But he really shouldn't have. If he wanted to confess, he could, because people here were watching like they already knew what came next. And once the director died, he was going to corner them and interrogate them. Finally, he snapped and confessed. He'd sold the kids of that perverted noble house to twisted buyers and strange establishments. The man shot back, "What kind of places were they?" Right then, the director let out an ear-splitting scream, yelling for the military police even as he insisted a filthy old man was about to kill him, while the people who heard him turned to the man nearby and demanded what was wrong with Matlock. The director was sure he'd win, convinced the hero had finally dropped his guard until he unleashed his last trick, the holy spirit of flame, the salamander's fire magic. The hero spotted the projectile screaming toward him, and his eyes snapped wide with fear, because the director could erase him and the truth would die there, and in this whole city, nobody would ever buy a wanderer like him. And tomorrow, the director stays right where he is, while the hero snaps his hand in front of the projectile and swats it aside. The director is thrown into pure confusion, blurting for everyone to hold on, then straight up apologizes, insisting it's all his fault. But right when it happened, a punch snapped his head to the side. Then the hero could barely catch his breath. Ravi sprinted up and asked his daddy if he was okay. He said, "I'm fine." And only after that did it hit him who she'd been calling all along. Then the military police came barreling in, shouting for the director. They heard a scream just now, turned, and saw the director slumped unconscious, along with the others frozen in the ice beside him. They opened their mouths to ask questions, but when they spotted the girl clinging to that man, every word died in their throat. They begged to have everything explained, and when they pulled up the client list from the director's room, they finally convinced the military police to buy their story. They're hunting those trafficked kids down by any means they can get, and they've already clocked his true intentions. Looks like he's about to bring them home himself. Nobody could believe it. Turns out Desmond had fooled the whole city, and now volunteers are stepping in, taking turns babysitting the shelter children. The only thing keeping that city from breaking them was the kindness of the people there. So they headed back to the hotel, and the girl leaned over her gift box, staring at it like it was a clue, then asked what happened, because it was all crumpled up. He shot back that it was meant to be her gift. Yet when she finally asked to open the box, it was different now, and inside was a stunning bow. He'd grabbed it right before leaving the house, and now she was stuck there alone. Shame burned in him because she had to wear cheap clothes, so he acted weird on the spot. She apologized for being left alone, asked if she could put it on, and he immediately decided, "No, I'll do it for you." He lifted the bow, snapped it into her hair, and grinned, "It suits you perfectly." She blinked and asked why he'd picked it for her, and he admitted it wasn't originally hers at all. He'd met kids from an orphanage, watched them stare at gorgeous little dresses, and that envy hit him. The girl's cheeks burned as she blurted, "No, it's not like that." She wasn't staring at the dresses at all. She was fixated on the sweets they'd brought, and when the man finally got it, he broke into laughter. In the face of anger, despair, and sadness, joy is what finally smashes through the dark, and even this loner father still has a ton to learn. The night hadn't even peaked yet. Now they had to soak in the moonlight together, and for once, everything was going their way. The military police shoved them with orders to stay put in this city after the mess with Director Matlock, and now they're probably stuck in Addington for the next 4 or 5 days. Right now, they're camped at a tavern table, stuffing their faces as they wait. He's planning to grab some part-time shifts to stack up cash for their trip, but I can't stop wondering what Ravi's going to do. Will she really wait for him at the hotel? But she's desperate to stay with him, yet if it's work, she can't, so he urges, "Come with me." She blurts, "Is that even possible, and won't I slow things down?" He denied it because if things ever came down to it, he'd keep her safe with every breath, with nothing safer than standing right beside him. Yet now, that moment had arrived, and he'd prepared a proposal just for her. From this day on, wherever they go, he makes it a rule in his head. Keep that father-daughter bond strong, because he's not letting a disaster like the one from the other day hit them again. From now on, he'd introduce Ravi as his daughter to everyone, and Ravi would have to call him daddy right in front of them too. She wore an awkward, embarrassed look like she couldn't believe what was happening. Because of him, he blurted out, "Everything okay?" And when she hesitated, he shrugged, "If you don't want to, that's fine." But that wasn't what she meant at all. She wasn't sure she had the right to call him that, and then he smiled, said, "You can," and pushed her to try it right now. With cheeks burning, she blurted, "Dad." The guy's face lit up with the same kind of embarrassment, and the girl realized it probably sounded totally weird, at least by the look on his face, but he said nothing, just froze in awkward silence. Now they have to take on the quest. 2 days later, the day of the quest, he trekked through the forest with the kid. He leaned in and asked Ravi if she was cold, but she shook it off and said she was fine. The adventurer up ahead snapped his tongue, spun back on them and barked, "So you're treating me like I'm looking down on you just because I took on a task with a child." If this was all supposed to be a simple walk, he should have headed home by now, and the magician snapped back that he wouldn't cause him a single bit of trouble. He suddenly clocked it. The guy standing there was the commander of the self-defense forces they were riding with, and he looked straight up menacing, nothing like him at all. This time, the locals wanted one thing: take down that red-eyed dragon. Most Adventure Guild quests chase personal issues, so the pay and danger are usually pretty tame. But when you skip the guild, the job comes straight from the city or the whole country, and that changes everything. Sometimes you can even take them without a license, but the price is way more complexity. Red-eyed dragons are terrifying, relentless magical beasts, and the truth is they live for one thing: humans. Every year, once they crawl out of hibernation, they start building nests in the mountains right by human towns. So for years now, Addington has been wiping out dragons, and right in the middle of it all, they finally called a stop to grab lunch. The man and the child sat off to the side, far from everyone else, while the girl munched her sandwiches and gushed that the eggs tasted so light it was unreal. He smiled hard, hearing just how tasty she thought they were. This morning, he whipped up everything himself in the hotel kitchen. Egg sandwiches and beef meatball soup were on the menu. A few guys over, one dude with a bandaged head leaned in and grilled them about what they were eating. Was it really meatball soup? The other guys hanging back heard the word meatballs, and suddenly they understood exactly what that mouth-watering smell was. That soup would thaw their frozen bones for sure. Douglas swore they still had some left, then turned to Robbie and asked what she thought, and she just nodded back. The magician told everyone, "If you want to eat, we don't have much, so we'll all share one pot," and then he swore it would still warm them up a bit. Then the man shot back, "Are you sure?" Even though they liked the nasty attitude they got from both of them, he just grinned and told them not to worry, because with strangers in the mix, of course they'd stay on guard. The others scratched their heads, mortified, yet if he said it was true, they didn't care. To them, he looked like a genuinely good guy, and the first one to step up grabbed a glass, took a sip of the soup, and blurted that it was delicious. Nothing had ever tasted better. They asked what kind of meat he'd put in there, and he opened his mouth to answer, then snapped around and saw the same bearded man who'd yelled at him back on the road. The guy beside him warned, "If you're thinking about that bearded troublemaker, it's not worth it. Drop it and leave him alone." That's when they started yelling his name, Noyash, because what he said lit a fire of outrage in them. The young man basically shouted, "So why don't you just go talk to him?" And they shut him down and refused. They told him he was their leader, so breaking anything wasn't the move, yet the magician still stepped up to the man and warned him he'd end up freezing here, like, why not come eat soup with them instead? That man stared at him with pure fury, then erupted into more shouting. Why were they all swarming him with food? He snapped at them, calling out how they'd already forgotten why they were even here. And if they were done eating, then it was time to perform. Those words sent a cold shiver through everyone, and they scrambled to gear up for the next leg of the journey. Meanwhile, the bearded man stepped ahead. Noish stewed in fury beside Ravi, and Douglas trudged at the back with the baby strapped to his back. Suddenly, one of the adventurers snapped at everyone to gather, and when they followed the signs, they discovered massive animal tracks. Giant. Red-eyed dragons love swiping nests from other species, and these tracks smell like one of them started building right at the end. Because with how massive they are, this year they got away with it, and they should have been a lot worse. Everyone nodded along, and Douglas even spotted fresh tracks. While others urged them to rush, the magician snapped that they had to ditch this path. Everyone stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Then he dropped to the ground and told them to check the other tracks. The bearded man snapped back that those were nothing but deer or boar prints and warned that if he kept poking around, he'd send him flying. He said, "If it's a deer, you won't find hoof prints, but if it's a boar, you'll see tons of them." Then he pointed out that one chunk of the front print had the shape of the main hoof, showing it came from a rounded creature. This means the tracks are tied to the mythical beast unicorn, because the moment they appeared, everyone around erupted into screams, and once that creature is gone, you're probably never seeing it again. So why can't they take that route? They're sure unicorns are so skittish that if you don't crowd them, they won't dare to attack anyone. But it wasn't the unicorn that was the problem. It was the fact that he panicked hard, forgot to wipe his tracks, and left them behind, which is the only way this could have happened. It's the moment they bolt from a monstrous beast that chomps even mythical legends alive, and they've never heard of anything like it, because they've got zero clue what they're up against. Can you believe it? He's demanding they all head back today, even though that means walking straight into a fight where some massive, unknown monster is already waiting to crush them. Even in those insanely rare chances, death could still slam the door shut, and if they took a bad hit, it'd be game over before they even knew it. The bearded man kept roaring that their chatter was pure annoyance and that they needed to get control right now. Are all of them really this stupid? Douglas was nothing but a coward when he showed up, too ashamed to run by himself, so now he's trying to drag everyone down with him. The man surged ahead, barking that any girl who wanted to flee could walk right out the door, and that he'd have nothing to do with cowards, while the rest yelled for him to hold up and for everyone else to catch up right after him. The young man with the bandaged head snapped, "I'm sorry," and even as father and daughter were about to be stranded, they still had to head back, because the magician swore they'd come too, refusing to abandon them just like that. The young guy blurted that he was a father too, nothing like that bearded leader. So Douglas leaned in and asked whether the guys hanging around their boss were his sons and fathers too. But he's not their real dad. This bearded stranger has never even been married, yet the other guys still owe him big time because he saved their lives, so even with fear in their hearts, they fall in line behind him like he's family. Even after years in the self-defense forces, he can't stand this guy in the slightest. He's sure he can already walk away and resign, just like before. Noosh might already know this leader is impossible to handle because of his arrogance, but the moment he says the guy is like a father to them, everything changes. He finally gets it because now he's got something to protect too. I bet this leader is only worried about them. He tailed Noyash, and today was the first time he'd ever met their leader, but he can't shake the feeling the guy's just awkward and behind everyone else. Even during lunch break, he kept scanning the area like he was the only one who noticed, and the moment he shouted danger, he was the first to sprint straight into the mountains. He might look terrifying, but he's begging them to get the truth. This isn't hate, it's protection, because he did it so those guys wouldn't get hurt. If it's true, Noishu's nothing but dead weight, someone who can't even feel pain, and he still marched up to his uncle to ask what he thinks. But when he tried to ask, "Is he the same girl?" the magician didn't get a single word, and then sounds started creeping in from the side. They sprinted toward them and the soldiers panicked. What happened? Then Douglas gently shut the rabbi's eyes, warning him not to look, because all around them lay heaps of red-eyed dragon remains. Blood litters the ground so thick it looks like something already tore into them. But red-eyed dragons aren't mindless prey, they're beasts of a higher rank, so what if something found them and decided to eat anyway? He's right, something that deadly would hunt right by a city that has no dungeon close by, and that's what makes it so insanely strange. This red coal isn't just for show, it's used to smother smells, and those blood stains screamed a trail like something was coming. Then it hit him. A massive monster, a dragon clamped in its mouth, launched through the sky straight toward them. A demonic black dragon roared into the sky, an SS-ranked dragon king that could wipe out a whole village in an hour, while it devoured red-eyed dragons right in front of them, and the adventurers completely lost hope, knowing they could never beat something like that. They surged ahead, screaming and sprinting, trying to outrun the demonic black dragon, because it loves to lash out at the ones who bolt first. He roared at them to stop fleeing and slam into hiding instead. The dragon roared so loud they couldn't even hear him, then it struck and the hero barely dodged in time. He snapped, "Ravi, are you and the others who got hit okay?" They were still alive on the ground because the bearded man managed to blunt part of the hits, then he looked over and demanded, "You guys okay?" They nodded, fine and breathing, and with that danger handled, they could finally retreat and leave their luggage behind. Douglas clocked the chief's wounded leg and warned him, but the bearded man snapped that they had zero time to talk, so nobody even spared a glance at the injury. The bearded man announced he'd become the bait and told everyone else to sprint for their lives. Noyash begged him to stop, calling it madness, but he ignored her, because there was no way to outrun that dragon on foot, not with wounds like that. Douglas would never just toss him to his grave. He barked at Robbie to grip on tight, then started chanting the acceleration spell, pushing it to full power, igniting the explosion of speed, and Robbie screamed as the world shattered into motion. The others went wide-eyed at the way the magic surged, and everyone started wondering, could this ancient old man be some kind of magician on a level nobody could even understand? Noyash clamped his teeth down hard. He rushed up to the bearded man just as the dragon started blasting fire, yelled, dodged to the side now, and the bearded man did exactly that. He couldn't tear his gaze away from his target, so he hurled the spell again, demanding the ascending flight burn at full force, and the second the dragon spat its fire, he launched himself into the air. He dodged the black demonic dragon's strike by a hair. Now he has to hit the weak spot in its throat, right where the scales hide underneath, but that target's insanely hard to land. If he hangs in the air there, the dragon will nail him. A young guy with a bandage sprinted toward them, hauling the bearded man to his feet and yelling for him to hurry, while the guy snapped, calling him a lousy boy. Noyash convinced himself he'd been counting on that man the whole time in the self-defense force, but it was a total lie. Watching the old men go to work lit a fire in him, and he'd always craved one chance to be the one who saves him. The man heard him and without a word swallowed the help like it was destiny. While Douglas kept dodging the dragon midair, the guy yelled at his uncle to go all out, and Robbie backed him every step of the way. He told the others to back off and left it to him, because if he could weave magic, he'd blow the flames away with wind magic, while he simultaneously unleashed both hell ice and his flight magic skills. And that final blow dropped the dragon hard. When it was over, everyone regrouped and pleaded for forgiveness, believing the bearded man's words that he'd never meant to endanger them, and that his apology was real. The magician then stepped in, insisting everything was okay and telling him to lift his head. The rest backed up their leader. No one got hurt, so lift your head because he's badly injured. Douglas dropped into a crouch and begged to see his leg, using the very skills he'd used to help him. The others yelled at the leaders to move right now because he had to show his leg to the doctor. He shouted to Noyash too, telling him, "If I can't get up, I'll lean on you again, back to using my shoulder." People cheered him on, swearing they'd carry the noisy stuff next. Then reality hit hard. Those things turned out to be heavy, packed to the brim. He was handed the leader's belongings too, but those weren't just heavy. They felt impossible to lift, so after everything was wrapped up here, he had to rush back fast and then report to the mayor's office about the demonic black dragon. Sure, it made sense, but then what were they supposed to do with that dragon? They couldn't just dump it here, and they definitely couldn't butcher it with the gear they had right now. The mage whipped up wind magic and hoisted the dragon's corpse high, since its weight is packed tight in the belly, so the air can lift it, just as long as it doesn't start moving. They were all practically grinning at the old man, and their leader snapped, "Who is he?" Noyash shrugged, saying he didn't know, but you could tell he was a terrifyingly powerful adventurer, even with a kid in tow. After he wipes out the demonic black dragon, he marches back into the city, and the crowd surges in around the dragon's corpse in the center, watching in awe as he sincerely thanks everyone for helping end the chaos. Can you believe a black, demonic dragon would actually show up? If humans hadn't handled it, this whole city could have been erased from the map by now, so he asked for permission to thank them on the city's behalf. He ordered the prize to be handed straight to the Self-Defense Forces commander, because there were plenty of them, stacking even more rewards. Not only for taking down the red-eyed dragons, but also for crushing the black demon dragon. He wanted to up the reward, but it just fell apart somehow. Then the bearded man leaned in and told Douglas the gold was his, because only he had slain the demonic black dragon. Everyone else nodded in total sync, and they moved together while he was caught in the vision. He lifted a hand and refused it on the spot, even though he'd calmed things down. Then, out of nowhere, he turned into the attacker, and the whole win only happened because the other guys stepped up and played the tank. The man refused to play the lone tank. Sure, it wasn't that hard, they'd just been ambushed, until he met the dragon, and he wasn't about to fight it by himself. With the others stepping in, he figured out exactly how to bring it down. He suggested they split everything evenly since they'd fought for this win side by side, and the bearded man swore it was the honest truth. Then the others erupted in laughter. The man who stormed into the room could barely hide his shock, saying Douglas was truly unpredictable and secretly soft-hearted, too. Then he revealed he wasn't just any visitor, he was the guildmaster of Addington. Right after that orphanage disaster, he dug into the whole thing out of pure curiosity. Then, the moment he started wondering what rank he'd hit, he got the gut punch. His license was revoked. Turns out it really was true, but the real shock is why someone like him is back at it again, especially when he didn't even bother hiding it, just laid it all bare so blatantly. So we've got to start with the real mystery. Why did the guildmaster suddenly snap to attention about this? The master told them not to get the wrong idea. His cold, blunt way of talking is just his bad habit. He didn't mock the magician. He just couldn't wrap his head around revoking a warrior's license when that warrior can even defeat a black dragon. So he marched to the Balzac Guild to ask around, but the truth hit hard. He doesn't have the strength they're demanding, and that's why he's being shut out. Basically, this is what he's really trying to say. The Addington branch wants to hand him an application for a brand new license. He couldn't believe it. Issuing a license, would that really pull him back into being an adventurer? They'd hand it over as a thank you for saving this village, the best gift he could offer as guild master. So now the big question, will he accept? Everyone nearly choked on their own shock when the guild master personally handed them an invitation, something they'd never seen before. Wait, had he already cleared the entrance exam? But he insisted he'd take it again. And yeah, that made others furious, calling it downright cruel. They're already obsessing over him, even though they've only just met, so he's got real leadership energy too, but with everything happening right now, he just can't wrap his head around what the Balzac Guild answered. If the magician wants, he can file an investigation request with the committee. But for now, he demanded everyone wait just 1 minute. In the end, the guild's call wasn't wrong. Back then, he was dead weight, useless for any job, yet he'd once been a top officer, and somehow, everything spiraled straight into disaster. Even if he didn't get it, one thing was clear: this wasn't normal. No matter if he's injured or sick, if there's still a shot at recovery, his license just gets paused for now, temporarily. Turns out he really did have to spill it all because the truth was brutal. He was cursed. Everyone could tell it must have been hell living like that. Then the master bowed for forgiveness and promised, "I swear I won't stick my nose into anyone else's business anymore. But besides that, you're totally fine." He'll still team up with him to get a brand new license, and they've gotta pull it off ASAP. Noish, right at his side, told him this was probably the biggest relief of all, because sure, he'd suffered through so much, but now he could finally crawl back to his old life, and the magician started reliving every brutal moment. His old life looked bleak, like no matter what he did, he couldn't claw his license back, so why wasn't he smiling? Then it hit. His powers were back, and he was finally done with the grind of day jobs. But yeah, this current him isn't exactly celebrating. He stared at Ravi standing beside him as the master started insisting Douglas had to drop a document into his guild, and Douglas just snapped back that he wasn't done thinking about walking away from it. Everyone spun around, stunned by his refusal, because a license would completely shift his money situation. He knew that. Still, he didn't want to hit that return button anytime soon. He thanked them for worrying, then bowed his head and asked for their forgiveness. The master let out a heavy sigh and admitted he was truly sorry, saying it'd be wrong to push him. But the idea of the strongest traveler, not even part of the guild, stepping up as a guardian, that's a pretty wild kind of cool. The bearded man burst out laughing and shouting that everything was settled, so they had to grab drinks and celebrate right now, but the others quickly tried to shut him up, because they were still in the mayor's office. For a split second, he doubted he even wanted to be an adventurer again, because he was stuck with Ravi, and he had to put him first to repay the debt for getting him free of that curse. Meeting strangers in an unfamiliar village and laughing together was once impossible in his mind. Now he can't stop loving his life. 4 days later, the military police finally cleared his path and warned him that Matlock and his crew were being shipped to the prison in the royal capital any day now. The demonic black dragon's spoils got split up with the self-defense forces, and as for his cut, he pocketed some for travel expenses to Balzac, then gave the rest straight to the orphanage. Oh, and get this, the Matlock orphanage got renamed to Addington, and it looks like the whole town is running it now, so let's just hope the kids still trapped inside can finally live in peace. Ravi stepped out in those rich, gorgeous clothes, and she looked absolutely charming. Then he instantly caught himself and apologized, because he had to wonder, would that coat really fit her, or was there something better? He told her to look at the nicer option. But she liked it more like her dad's. They pushed deeper through the city, and soon all that remained were just a couple of spots. An old man named Theo called out to them, asking straight up if they were already heading out of town. Right when his thoughts were circling his story, the necklace came back into focus, because was he about to sell it again? He couldn't explain how something that rare ever landed in his hands, but the moment he broke the spell, it dropped right beside him, and even then, he still didn't have the full picture. Tio heard the whole thing and exploded that it was a cursed dark thing, no way he'd ever buy it. And the stunned magician fired back that he'd already broken the curse, so the accessory was safe. He let out a heavy sigh because even if it was true, this still didn't sit right with him. He was a good guy, but his lack of tact was a mess, and he couldn't stop wondering why it had to be like this. They barely know each other, but he's got a contact, Baron Morse, a rich man in Milton, the Pleasure City, who collects cursed relics and everything tied to the supernatural. Knowing him, he'll nod at any price and he'll go visit him. He thanked him, swearing he owes the old man everything, but deep down he thought, this is how a merchant does customer service. Keep the buyer satisfied and they'll come back and spend their money again. He heard something from his side and spun around, only to find a massive crowd of residents packed in tight, staring at him like he was the show. He had no clue why until one of them stepped forward and spilled the truth. People were whispering about an adventure and something about a child. Then he asked point blank, was he the one? Turns out he caught the director in the act, then took down a giant dragon. Now the whole city won't stop talking about it. They're calling him the real deal, the hero who solved the case, because if he hadn't gone there, more people would have died. They started calling him Addington's hero, and the boy immediately shot that down, saying he just did what he could. For everyone else, his quiet humility looked beautiful too. He clutched Robbie to his chest and urged, hold on tight. But the crowd was already closing in on them. From the sidelines, someone yelled at Douglas that he couldn't handle the crushing crowd, like the others were praising him, and a ring of adventurers swarmed in, jostling and driving people back to make him stand his ground. He demanded to know what they were doing here, and of course they hurried over to see him off, ready to guard this hero, because they couldn't stand the thought of his memories of this city getting destroyed. Douglas, they said, decided to push a little harder, wishing him to stay strong and come back to the city someday, and the magician, grinning, waved them off with his daughter. For the first time, he leaves like that, unsure he'll ever see them again, yet he'll never forget them. He's overflowing with gratitude for meeting them in this city, and he yells after them, telling them he's in their debt and that they've got to stay healthy too. Douglas and Robbie lounged on the stone bank by a small river with a backpack right beside them, while Douglas stared at the water and realized 2 whole days had slipped since they left Addington, so the trek south rolled on. Douglas rubbed his chin, eyes locked on Robbie as he tipped his flask back, and Douglas couldn't stop thinking, so this is it, the city of pleasures, Milton, and then he stared ahead, deep in thought. Douglas dropped to one knee, shot Ravi a question without even looking up. So, do you like fish? Ravi glanced at him and said, yeah, I do, and right in front of them a tiny spotted fish flickered through the river. Douglas pushed himself up on both feet and cheered, saying that was awesome. Now they'd go catch and cook fish for dinner. Ravi stayed squatting, staring at him, thinking, how's he even going to pull that off? Douglas dragged his hand across his chin, grinned, and said he'd use his skills. Ravi would help him today. Ravi shot Douglas a nod and agreed to help, then stared at the cloth and rope on the ground as Douglas claimed they'd already gathered everything they needed. Chocolate vine ivy, a jute bag, and the 3 branches Ravi had brought. So Ravi stood right beside him and gripped those branches in her hands. Douglas began building and told Ravi, first, tie the branches together, then hook on the jute bag and you've got yourself a fishing net. With the net finished, Douglas lifted it up and Ravi threw her hands in the air, grinning with pure joy. Douglas and Ravi waded into the water, shallow enough that it only reached Ravi's knees. Douglas told Ravi to drive the fish straight toward him, but Ravi just couldn't wrap her head around how to do that. Douglas gripped the net and spun toward Ravi, telling her to learn how to do it herself. He'd dry her clothes later, no need to hold back. Rocky hovered nearby as she leaned down toward the water. Ravi dipped her hands into the water, then the fish burst up right in front of her, and her eyes went wide as her mouth dropped open in pure shock. Douglas still gripped the net and snapped at Ravi to switch it up, and the 2 of them stood apart in the river while Ravi churned the water into splashes. Then Douglas's jaw dropped at what he just saw. Douglas planted himself in the water with his net ready, and the fish surged toward him. Then one unlucky fish leapt into the air and landed right above his net. Ravi erupts in joy, screaming at the top of his lungs as he thrusts both hands into the air. 2 fish sat on skewers, sizzling over an open fire. When Rathai grabbed one and dove in first bite, big smile, she said it was delicious, and Douglas shot her a warning. Watch out for the bones. Douglas jumps in and starts eating the fish too, staring at the sizzling trout. He swears he tossed in salt as a seasoning, because this season's silver cherry trout comes out clean, soft, and so fluffy it practically melts. Douglas and Ravi sat beside the crackling fire, digging into dinner, and Douglas leaned in asking, "Did we do a good job today?" Ravi nodded hard, while the flames snapped and danced right beside them. Douglas stared ahead, lost in thought, while Ravi zipped up her jacket and said she just had a bad feeling, like the sky was set to rain today. Douglas and Ravi stood locked inside fields and cradled by mountains, while clouds drifted overhead like they owned the sky. Then Douglas demanded how she'd somehow figured it out, and Ravi just smirked that she could read the weather, leaving Douglas staring in shock. Douglas beckoned Ravi closer, jabbed his finger toward the clouds, and Ravi crouched to follow the spot, watching as Douglas told him those were cumulonimbus, the kind that can unleash a quick burst of rain. Ravi shot his gaze upward, locked in, when a single drop of water splattered his head. Douglas pointed out that the stream had been running heavier than usual before, but it was probably too soon for the weather to flip. Then bam, a brutal downpour hammered Ravi and Douglas, both still sitting on the ground, and they stared in stunned disbelief at the chaos. Douglas and Ravi trudged down the road in raincoats as the fields and mountains vanish in sheets of pouring rain, and Douglas scoops Ravi into his arms while murmuring that it's almost too ironic, and that Ravi just has to stay patient a little longer. He glances down, relieved he grabbed Ravi a coat before the storm, because the nearest town is still at least half a day's walk away. Douglas snaps that they need to find somewhere to rest. Then there it is, a little horse-drawn cart sitting right ahead of them. Rain hammered down as a cart jammed with supplies rattled along. One man sat inside, and another strained with all his might, trying to shove the stuck cart free. Douglas peers ahead and figures the cart's jammed in this relentless rain, trapping the strangers inside, while Ravi stays cradled in his arms. Then Douglas marches up to the cart, still holding Ravi, and offers to help the strangers get free. The stranger yanks out his arrows, and right then Douglas snaps into a defensive stance. The bow is in the stranger's hands, a cart sits behind him, Douglas squares up in front, and the stranger even says he's sorry, but refuses to let any man help him, warning Douglas and Ravi to get out fast. In the cart sat a cloaked child who blurts out the word people, and Douglas freezes, staring at these strangers like they've just dropped from the sky, because right in front of him, it feels like an elf father and his child. Douglas still sees that thick forest in his mind where he heard elves never leave the place they were born. Outside it, you barely ever meet them. They're a whole different kind of people, careful and cold, and they act arrogant toward humans. When the moment comes, Douglas shoves Ravi behind his back, and the elf raises his bow straight in front of him. Douglas shattered the silence, apologized for startling the strangers, and said he was only passing through. Then he offered his help again. The elf stayed quiet, bow in hand. Douglas pulled off his hood and admitted he does the same when worry hits, especially because he has a child, and a stranger should always be able to count on him. Ravi stood there, frozen in place, while the elf and his child stared at Douglas and Ravi with sharp worry, until the elf finally caved, lowered his bow, and gratefully thanked Douglas for coming to the rescue. Douglas strode up to the cart, dropped his backpack on the ground, and shrugged off his cloak. The elf warned that the load inside was too heavy to lift together, so Douglas told everyone to back up just a little. The elf kid blurted out that Douglas might not be trustworthy with these people, and right then the elf cut him off, snapping that he needed to speak with more respect. Douglas clenched the cart's handles as someone shouted a spell, ignite, full power, and the elves went wide-eyed, shocked. At that moment, Douglas's muscles swelled, his teeth clenched tight, and steam blasted from his mouth. Then he yanked the cart forward as everything started to spill out, while Ravi and the two elves stood right behind him. Ravi shot her hands up in disbelief, and the two elves stared in awe as the cart rolled forward. Then Douglas slammed it to a stop just a few meters later. Even the horses looked stunned, and the elf's child leaned in, amazed and wide-eyed, asking how in the world this happened. The elf grabbed Douglas's things, thanked him like he'd saved their lives, and Douglas simply turned away, telling them not to worry, because helping them felt like the least he could do. Louis the elf thrust Douglas's things back into his hands and apologized for his rudeness. Then Douglas saw the name on the air, Louis. His son, Nicky, stood right behind him, staring at Douglas with wide-eyed admiration. Nicky scrambled into the cart, Ravi lunged for Douglas, and Louis stood there clutching the goods as he announced, because gratitude demands it, he was going to hand them a few surprises. Douglas thanked him for the stash and told him to stick around and wait out the rain with them. Louis met Douglas's eyes and said, "You and Ravi can stay with us, don't miss the point. The elves are careful, not ungrateful." Then Douglas tugged Ravi's hood and nodded, "I'm with you, Louis." Nicky yanked herself out of the car, grabbed Ravi's sleeve, and blurted, "Come on." Ravi snapped back that the kids were crammed in the back, so Douglas and him had to follow, yet Nicky's sudden reappearance rattled them both. Ravi yanks his sleeve right out of Nikki's grasp. Nikki and Douglas stare at her in shock. Ravi locks eyes with Nikki, and she immediately turns bright red, blurting that he was just about to offer her his hand. Lewis hauls everything to the cart and blurts out that Douglas has a cute daughter. Then Douglas lifts Ravi and gapes at Lewis before nodding along. Just like that, the cart rumbles into motion. Nikki perched on the wooden boxes in the wagon and raved that Ravi's father was amazing, then blurted that she couldn't figure out how Douglas could even move the wagon. At the front, Louis and Douglas sat tight. Ravi kept nodding along in confusion, and Douglas quietly studied Nikki's every move. Douglas sat beside Louis, then his smile crept in like, yeah, I'm terrible with Ravi, because she'd been alone in the shelter and she might still be hiding her embarrassment around kids her age. The horses kept moving, and as Douglas watched, he realized just how awkward he could be around people. So he finally understood her struggles. On top of that, her personality only made everything harder, turning the whole situation into a real, tough problem. Douglas cupped his chin like he was plotting, wishing Ravi could finally find some friends, and just then Louis grinned and said, "We've arrived." Ravi and Douglas snapped their heads up in shock. There, dangling in the branches, were tiny houses on the trees. Yep, they'd landed in the elven village, Floria. The boys yanked the cart to a stop and sprinted straight for one of the tree houses. Ravi rubbed her hair dry with a towel while Douglas sat beside her, folding whatever he could get his hands on, and then a woman with a sketch of a face painted across her skin rushed up to them, telling them her husband had mentioned them, thanking them over and over for helping her when the rain hit. The woman snatched Douglas's belongings, told Douglas's things that Ravi should bunk with them for the night to ride out the rain, and Douglas shot back with a hard no. Right then, someone burst into the room and began throwing spells. A blinding flash lit up Douglas and Ravi, and both of them snapped their heads toward the beam in shock. Douglas immediately figured it was wind magic, the same magic that was drying their clothes. Lewis pulled his wife into a tight hug while Nikki stood beside them, beaming, and then Lewis snapped his spell into place, tossing out a command that made Douglas drop his modesty. Douglas and Ravi watched in awe, totally captivated. Douglas hauled himself up off the floor and told Lewis they were ready to stay the night. Anything he needed, they'd help. Ravi slid beside him and stared at Douglas. A feast of food sat on the table as everyone crowded in, and Louis warned that they barely ever left the village, because outside, shopping was the only reason, and dangers and monsters lurked everywhere. Nikki hauled in a book and asked Douglas if he'd ever seen mermaids. Douglas leaned on the memory of mermaids' beauty and swore that in the southern seas there was a pirate crew led by mermaids. He'd even tangled with them once, and yeah, they were enemies, but their singing was pure enchantment. Nikki practically bounced and asked Douglas if he'd ever spotted a dragon, and Douglas looked her straight in the eye and said he'd just stumbled on them lately. Then Nikki turned to Ravi, asked the same thing, and froze in place with that book still clutched in her hands. Rain hammered the sky, and Nick's excited screams kept pouring out of the treehouse, until one relative snapped that if he wanted to talk, he'd better sit down and start explaining everything. Louis's wife scrubbed dishes in a basin, steam rising from magic, while Douglas sat there digging through stuff beside him, giant bases piled close. An elderly elf hovered nearby, his thick, long eyebrows and full beard framing a sharp stare. The moment Louis started talking, Douglas snapped his head around, and you could tell he'd gladly taken the credit, because Louis was thanking him for the valuable experience he'd earned today. Louis slid down beside Douglas, clutching 2 cups and a jug, and said, "This is the first time I've talked to someone from another race, maybe elves, and I'm still trying to figure out how I even live in my own little world," while Douglas stretched out his hand to grab the cup. Louis pours Douglas a cup and tells him he bets Douglas thinks elves never open their hearts to other races. Then Douglas's nerves hit hard, his shoulders slump as he convinces himself he messed up and he's terrible at talk like this. Across from them, Nikki and Ravi sit with the kids in view, and one of them flicks a spell into the air. Nikki grinned and whispered that light's magic is pure radiance. Then she shot a finger upward and a glowing ball of light burst into the air above the guys. Ravi stared in shock, trapped there, unable to look away. The ball dropped right in front of Douglas and Louis, and Douglas's jaw went slack with shock. He'd always thought elves were experts in everyday magic, but seeing it handled like this at such a young age blew his mind. Ravi spun toward Douglas and blurted, "Dad, could she do the same if she trained in magic?" Douglas froze in shock, stunned that Ravi wanted skills too. Then Ravi grinned and nodded, agreeing with him. Nikki burst out laughing and promised he'd teach Ravi himself. Then he shoved his hands out in front of him, and a blazing light snapped to life between his palms. "Remember the spell I said," he told Ravi. Now focus the power right here in your hands. Douglas and Leo leaned in, grinning as the kids talked. Nikki hissed, "Squeeze hard," and told Ravi, "Try chanting once with me." Then Nikki and Ravi dropped to their knees and chanted together. Ravi pressed her hands forward, echoed the spell, and a bright light flared between her palms. Then the world went pitch black. Ravi was on his knees. Nikki knelt in front of her. Adults sat close and watched in silence, and Ravi said through a heavy sigh that she couldn't. Douglas rose to speak, but Louis snapped his hand up to stop him, then pressed 2 fingers to his face and signaled silence. Douglas glanced around, clearly on edge. Nikki told Robbie not to fret, it wouldn't work right away. Nikki broke into a huge grin and said it even took him a month, but if Robbie truly wanted to learn, he'd take care of it while she was here. Robbie stared at Nikki in shock. Louis lifted his cup to his lips. Doug looked away, then forced out a nervous smile and scratched the back of his head, because the truth hit him. Getting his first skill wasn't easy for him either, since he had zero idea how to learn it. Douglas couldn't figure out why Robbie was begging to learn those skills. Robbie was down on one knee, staring up at Douglas, while Nikki stood right beside her. Nikki stared at Ravi and blurted, "Since I'm here, we've gotta get Grandpa to test my skills." Ravi immediately froze in embarrassment, while Louis and Douglas stared in shock. Nikki stood up and said, "That power only clicks if you're born with the talent. If you don't have that natural spark, then no amount of practice will ever matter." Tears stung Robbie's eyes as Douglas spiraled into panic, unable to think of a single move. Louis praised Nikki, and Nikki took his grandfather's hand, saying it was better to learn the truth now than to break down later. Robbie dropped to her knees and shook. Grandpa Nikki just couldn't figure out what anyone expected from him. Nikki insisted he had to test Robbie's aptitude for the skill, and then Grandpa Nikki snapped his eyes wide open. Ravi and Douglas stared at the old man in pure horror, and when Grandfather finally slid into the chair across from Ravi, the rest hovered nearby, watching every second. Douglas' stomach flipped with nerves, and he agreed with Nikki's skills are set in stone at birth and never change, while Grandfather stared hard at Ravi. Beads of sweat rolled down her face as panic tightened in her chest. Grandpa stayed planted across from Ravi, saying there were certain abilities as Nikki stood beside him. Then Grandma swept in, clutching a blanket in both hands, while Douglas and Louis looked on, totally on edge. Robbie shot her hands up and called Douglas, and you could tell he was on edge just watching everything unfold. With tears spilling, she begged to learn those skills, and Douglas, shaking with nerves, admitted he already knew. Nikki volunteered to show Ravi his skills as a live demo, and Louis snapped that the best way to learn is to watch it happen and feel it firsthand. Then Douglas jumped in, grinning, saying Louis was totally right. Douglas shot his hands forward and told Robbie to lock in. He cast the spell, and a blob of light burst into his palms. Then his nerves spiked because he feared he'd misjudged the energy. Douglas knelt beside Ravi and the others, and before anyone could breathe, a brutal flash of light lit the whole room. Then everything went pitch dark. Ravi toppled into disorientation, her eyes still burning from the glare, and Douglas, shaking with nerves, hurried to beg her forgiveness. Grandpa snapped awake and roared that it was morning. Douglas jumped in, nervously apologizing for what he'd done while the others were still reeling from the blast. Louis rubbed his eyes, stunned, and blurted, "It's like pure heaven." Ravi stood beside Douglas, and when Louis asked, "Where did that wild light skill come from, Douglas?" Nikki grinned and said, "Because Douglas is seriously cool." A sudden flash ripped across Douglas and Robbie's faces. White light blasted the whole area. Everyone froze in confusion and fear, and then a brutal loud boom crashed through the air. Douglas yanked Ravi into a hug and blurted that it was lightning, like the sky had struck and somehow trees had come down. "Guys, are you okay?" he demanded. Louis nodded hard and muttered that he just hoped none of that mess had landed on someone's house. Douglas swallowed hard and asked, "So there isn't a lightning rod anywhere in this village?" Louis shot back, "Nope, this place won't use things made by other races," then added that the elves keep lightning at bay with festivals that chase the storm away. Douglas figured this was an elven tradition, so he kept his distance. Outsider or not, he wouldn't meddle, and then everyone surged into the center of the house. Another elf barges into Louis's house, breathless and shouting that disaster just struck. Lightning hit Muro's place and a fire erupted, and every attempt to stamp it out has failed as flames rage out of control, threatening to torch everything, while Louis, Douglas, and Ravi just freeze in horror listening. Douglas and Ravi freeze in total shock as a towering blaze roars in front of them, because at this pace, they're convinced the whole forest is about to go up in flames. Douglas strides to the front door where Louis is waiting and tells him he'll go see if he can help with anything. Then he turns and calls out to Ravi, Meanwhile, Lewis swings the door open to reveal the elf standing there, and Douglas whips his gaze toward the doorway. The elf braved the rain and started pointing like it was an emergency, asking why a man was here, while Douglas snapped his gaze away in silence. Then Douglas grabbed Ravi and hauled himself out through the window, telling Louis he was sorry, but he'd go first. Lewis fretted over Douglas's reckless move as Douglas scrambled onto the window, cradling Ravi, insisting everything was fine. Then he raised his hand and cast a spell. Douglas hurled another spell, and right alongside Ravi he blasted into the air, veering away from Louis' house in the opposite direction, while Louis shot up from his spot and stared out the open window, stunned by what Douglas could do. The night clung to the shadows, rain hammering the streets, and an elven villager dropped to his knees, begging anyone please for help. He screamed that his wife and child were trapped under the rubble, while she and the little one were pinned beneath blazing tree debris, flames swallowing everything in sight. The woman clung to her child right there under the rubble, while the other villagers thrust their hands up and blasted magic to kill the flames. Only the fire roared louder, burning hotter with every second. An old villager warned, if this keeps going, the forest will turn to ash. So they demanded every last tree be cut down, and Douglas roared, "Everyone back now," as he prepared to fight the flames himself. The villagers froze in shock as Douglas hit the ground beside them, clutching Ravi in his arms, still gripping her cloak tight. Everyone in the village went wide-eyed, because why was a man lurking in their forest at all? Douglas wasted no time and started casting a spell. Then a huge mass of water erupted out of the air. Douglas kept on chanting, and that mass of water swelled bigger and bigger, until a monstrous water ball slammed into the sky over the villagers, leaving everyone there utterly baffled. Douglas pinned Ravi with one hand and blasted the open flames with his other, as water roared down and drowned the fire. The rain kept hammering down, and a villager hissed that the flames were still roaring. Douglas strode up, telling him straight, "I know elves are careful creatures. If they don't want them in the forest, they can walk away right now." Douglas scooped Robbie into his arms and shouted that the fire had to be put out first, because he was going to save everyone trapped in the flames, no matter how they suffered. The villagers, young and old, stared at Douglas and Robbie with sharp, wary eyes. An elderly villager shot his hand up and said he finally understood everyone's worries, but now it was time to join forces with Douglas. Then Douglas just gave a quiet smile as Louis and his wife stepped up behind him. Louis and his wife were terrified for Ravi. Then Douglas finally let her hit the ground, but she refused to let go, clinging to Douglas's pant leg like her life depended on it. Douglas stared at Ravi and she warned him to stay sharp. Then Douglas grinned at Ravi's words, telling her, "You can count on me." Villagers surged to the scene, some chanting spells, others rushing to the wounded amid the flames, while Douglas grabbed a chunk of fallen wood and pried the trapped victims free. Douglas gripped the stone in both hands, then spun around the moment he heard a villager crying for help. Douglas spotted a bunch of men hauling a massive tree out of the rubble, while trapped villagers cried for help beneath it. Douglas sprinted to the huge fallen tree, shouted for everyone to back up, and promised, "I'll take care of it." A villager blinked in disbelief, wondering how he could possibly help, and Douglas answered by grabbing the tree with both hands. Douglas snapped a spell and swung a massive chunk of wood up over his head, while the other villagers froze in stunned silence, staring. Douglas clutched a tree above his head and heard a villager call him a monster, while the rain kept hammering down and he and the others plowed through the rubble. The woman and child were still as stone, while their husband dropped to his knees, panicking hard. One of the elves screamed that the wounds were deadly and demanded a doctor, but Douglas stepped in and told them, no doctors needed. Douglas shot his hand out and started the spell. Right away, a glowing dome of magic snapped into place over the woman and the child, while the other elves stared in shock at what he was doing. She crushed her child in a tight hug, snapped her eyes open, and Douglas kept right on chanting, telling the wound to heal right now. The elf wrapped his arms around his wife and child, and sobs tore out of him like he couldn't hold it back anymore, while Douglas stood right beside them, staring at the family finally reunited. Douglas stepped aside and stared. Rain had nearly quit, and he swore the fire looked like it died out. But he and Ravi had already kicked up a massive storm in the village because they weren't even supposed to be there. Douglas stepped through the ruins with a grin, even though he could feel bad for Louis and everyone stuck here. But him and Ravi still had to push on to another city. And just as he started, a voice shouted his name, snapping him around to face the caller. Douglas spun around and the whole village was down on their knees, shouting thanks to him like their lives depended on it. Robbie stood there, clutching her wife Louie in her arms, and watched everything unfold. Next day rolled in and Douglas peered out the window with relief. The sky finally cleared, but the night's destruction was absolutely brutal and the villagers kept hauling away rubble from the collapsed houses. Douglas swung toward Louis and said, "If it doesn't bug anyone, we'll help her move everything. Just say the word and we're ready to go." Louis grinned and replied, "We'll all be happy to help." Then Douglas leaned in toward Ravi and asked, "So what are you doing here?" Ravi has zero time to reply. Nikki's scream hits the air right away, so he tells her he'll go too if Ravi rushes to help everyone. Louis stays put and shuts his son down, refusing to join, while Robbie just stands there in silence, seething inside as Nikki snaps that Louis treats him like a kid, and Roddy quickly tells Douglas she's staying in the house with Nikki. Douglas stood up, convinced the kids would be safer together than stuck with the adults, and then Douglas and Louis headed straight for the villagers. A resident stepped up, smiled at them, and shouted that Douglas was a true strong man. Douglas froze in shock. Villagers had ringed him in tight circles and they started thanking him, grabbing his hands and shaking them hard. Confusion hit Douglas next, but he just smiled and told them he was glad to help. Douglas froze there, utterly confused. Then one of the young villagers snapped that they needed to show Douglas their team spirit, so the villagers grabbed a massive tree and started hauling it into place, leaving Douglas stunned by every second of it. Douglas rubbed his chin like he was plotting something big, and Louis leaned in to tell him the residents were stronger than ever, because Douglas's support had won their admiration. Douglas froze at Louis's words. Louis claimed the elf race is still weak, so Douglas snapped his gaze back to the tree where the girls stood, watching him. Douglas stared at the girls, and heat rushed into his cheeks as embarrassment hit him hard. The whole village snapped to attention when one resident shouted that it was harvesting time. Then, after a while, the sky swallowed the light and the bell rang. Douglas and Louis barged into Louis's house and his wife was already waiting with nerves on edge. Douglas frowned. This cleanup wasn't done. No elves in this forest could have tossed out a strength buff, so he decided he'd jump in and help them deal with that fallen giant tree. Ravi sprinted up to Douglas, and the second she saw him back, pure relief lit up her face. Louis's wife gripped a tray and swore Ravi never stopped practicing magic, while Nikki kept smiling, saying he acted like a teacher, and then he threw Ravi into brutal, intensive training. Ravi flashed a grin and said she still couldn't do it. Then Douglas just stared, stepped closer, and asked if she was okay while Nikki stood right beside them. Douglas sat there with a knot in his stomach, convinced Ravi only smiled when she was happy, like she was pushing the smile out of herself. So he gently traced her face and told her he'd check her status fast. Douglas thrust his hand toward Ravi's face. Bam! Mystic symbols erupted in midair, while Douglas muttered his own spell under his breath. Meanwhile, Ravi's hair started whipping and flying in every direction. Symbols flashed before Douglas and her status read, "She has a cold." Douglas grabbed Ravi by the shoulders and blurted, all shaky, "She's sick, she's tired." The elves urged them to call a doctor, but Ravi just stood there in silence. Then a faint blush crept onto her face. Ravi sprawled in bed under a blanket as Douglas perched beside her, eyes fixed on her like he wasn't going anywhere. He kicked himself for missing it earlier. His healing skill only mends physical wounds, and it won't touch diseases at all. Ravi sprawled against the pillow, cheeks burning red, and Douglas figured the grueling magic practice had finally wiped her out. So he sat beside her, baffled, wondering why she kept pushing herself to practice again and again. Douglas perched on the branch that ran through the house, and Ravi said she was begging for forgiveness because she kept stirring up trouble, leaving Douglas stunned by every word. Ravi snapped her eyes open and blurted that she wanted to be with Douglas, so Dad kept carrying her along with him, but with Mr. Beard and everyone else furious, Douglas couldn't forget the seething anger on their faces. Douglas rose to his feet and Ravi kept lashing out, calling her nothing but a burden, someone who couldn't help. Then she blurted that she just wanted to learn magic so she wouldn't drag Douglas into trouble. Ravi's tears spilled as she begged for forgiveness, and when Douglas finally met her eyes, it clicked. So that was why Ravi had been obsessed with mastering the skills all along. Douglas rested his hand on Ravi's bed and told her, straight up, he'd never once seen her as a burden. Then his mind slammed back to her face. He knew no matter how many times he tried, she wouldn't be able to forgive herself. Even that morning, she stayed home, not because of Nika, but because the words hit hard, the ones saying children can't really help adults. Douglas replayed every brutal problem they'd face on the road and realized bringing Ravi on that hike was a terrible call, because the mess they'd already landed in kept piling up, and it made her worry even more. Douglas slid up beside the bed, wiped Ravi's tears away, and told him, when life throws us into something brutal, he'll think for himself and act on his own, but he won't make the final call, just like Ravi. Douglas stared at Ravi and insisted they'd figure out the next move together. Robbie grinned and agreed, then promised she'd do her best not to be a burden. Douglas dropped into a squat beside the bed and told her she wasn't a burden, even as he understood the storm inside her. She just had to rein it in so he wouldn't keep worrying. Robbie cracked a warm smile and nodded right along. Then Lewis walked in, saying the doctor would arrive any moment. Douglas thanked him, then looked back at Robbie. Douglas shot up and told Robbie that if she wanted food, he'd cook. Then Robbie smiled and demanded the very soup Douglas made on the first day they ever met. Douglas shot back that he'd get it done immediately, then bolted out of the room and hit the stairs. Lewis' wife thrust a tray of food into Douglas' hands and told him to bring it straight to Robbie. Douglas grinned at how the little treats looked like baby rabbits. Douglas grabbed the tray and asked how she cut the food like that, then begged her to teach him. The woman burst into laughter and told him he was a great father, and Douglas couldn't help but chew on her words. Louis' wife blurted out that she couldn't believe it when Douglas clocked the shift in Robbie's condition, because raising a child is brutal and it's not like anyone can just handle it effortlessly. Douglas admitted straight up that he still wasn't coping very well. Robbie's soup bubbled away while Louise's wife showed Douglas how to slice rabbits out of fruit the right way, and Douglas nailed a whole bunch onto a tray. Robbie was chowing down on sap when Douglas leaned in and asked if she wanted something else. Then he rushed over with apples, and Louis' wife helped him slice them up. Robbie's eyes lit up. He couldn't stop smiling, completely amazed and thrilled. Douglas thrust a tray of sliced fruit toward her. Douglas gripped the tray and Robbie said she loved the rabbits in the back. Then Douglas blurted out, all nervous, that he wasn't the one who cut them up properly. Robbie flashed a grin as she cradled a slice of fruit, then pointed to the bowl of soup beside her. I like this rabbit more, she said, and right there, pure joy spilled into Douglas's eyes as tears burst out. Douglas and Ravi milked the villagers' kindness, staying right there with Louis' crew until Ravi finally healed up, and while they waited, Douglas pitched in and helped the villagers clean the place up. Right before they were set to leave the village, Nika's grandfather slid across from Ravi and grilled him again, while everyone else huddled nearby, watching like hawks. Then he jerked his hand up in front of Ravi's face and declared he could see something. Grandpa kept reassuring Ravi, no need to stress, she's got real talent for learning new skills, and Ravi and Douglas lit up with joy while Grandpa drove home the same point. She'll have to work hard to awaken that power. Ravi and Douglas sat face to face with their grandfather, hanging on every word as he declared that Ravi's skill potential was **5. 120 **, and Douglas nearly burst with delight and shock, while Ravi stared, totally clueless about what those numbers even meant. Douglas explained that a person's usable potential usually hits a score of 3. If it's 0, they've got no natural spark for skills at all, and the higher that number climbs, the easier it becomes to master even the toughest techniques. Robbie leaned in and asked Douglas's skill potential. Douglas snapped back, 900, and Louis' jaw dropped in shock, because he couldn't wrap his head around how something that small could still fuel spells that powerful. Grandpa challenged Douglas's potential, and Douglas nodded, ready to prove himself. Grandpa grilled Douglas's potential, and once again Douglas claimed it was 900, but Louis just wouldn't buy it. Grandpa shot back that Douglas had poured a ton of work into his spells, and Douglas and Louis both stared him down, stunned. Grandpa rubbed his hands together and said he truly admired Douglas and everything he'd fought through so far. Then Douglas grinned at him like he couldn't believe it. At a tiny fence, the villagers were waving Douglas and Ravi off while Nikki stood there with his head bowed, asking if they really meant to leave, but when Douglas and Ravi thanked everyone, they never even heard him. Douglas and Ravi stared at Nikki, stunned, as Nikki burst out yelling, saying Ravi still hadn't learned a single skill, that she'd catch a cold again and they'd better head straight to the village, leaving Ravi staring back in shock. Nikki's screams shot even higher as she blurted that she loved Ravi, swearing she wanted to stay with her forever and make her his bride. Douglas froze, stunned by every word. The villagers started whispering to each other, and Douglas could only stare, because he was the one guy who somehow missed what was going on between Nikki and Ravi. Nikki opened her mouth to say more, but Ravi cut in, clinging to Douglas, and declared that she likes him. Nikki couldn't even speak after hearing it, and the women of the village shot Douglas glances full of embarrassment and warmth as they watched everything unfold. Douglas and Ravi stood there, stunned, when Louis finally told Nikki it wasn't the moment to bring up the topic. Douglas scratched his ear, embarrassed and unsure, wondering if he could really be Robbie's adoptive dad. because the thought felt insanely sweet and he genuinely, wholeheartedly cared for Robbie. Ravi clung to Douglas, and in his head he thought if Douglas were really his father, he'd be struck with way more sincere awe. Then their moment shattered when that sharp laughter erupted and both of them froze. Lewis gently ran his hand over the head of his rejected son, then strode up to Douglas and told him to ignore Nikki, because they say boys only grow up with broken hearts. Douglas stared at Lewis, stunned. Louis shoved the whole village's gifts into Douglas's hands, and Douglas shot back a grateful thanks. Then Douglas and Ravi bowed to the entire village and sprinted off together. The villagers shot waves back at Douglas and Robbie, and Louis locked eyes on Robbie and Douglas, counting to 2. Every single villager roared the words, "Muscle power," as Douglas and Ravi stared, watching their village tear away into the distance. Nikki was still parked at the spot where he'd said goodbye to Robbie when Louis finally rolled up and asked how much longer Nikki planned to stay there. Nikki just told his father that the moment he grew up, he'd leave the village for good. Nikki couldn't stop picturing mermaids, and the Douglas filled his head with secrets you'd only find in books. Now he's desperate to see it all for himself, mastering new skills step by step as he sets out on a journey. Nikki choked back bitter tears and begged to see Ravi again. Lewis stared at his son, then slowly raked his hand through his hair and told him he just knew Nikki would make it. He was proud, plain, and simple. Lewis crouched right beside him, and together they stared out into the distance. Douglas and Robbie pushed on, leaving the last stretch of road behind them. Douglas clutched everything the village had handed him, convinced he'd finally found happiness. After all, Alvin's village had welcomed him, and it was the coziest place he'd ever felt. Douglas dug into his bag and yanked out a letter. Louis had sincerely thanked him for his help, and now he was seriously mulling over installing a lightning rod. Douglas stared at the words on the page, shocked beyond belief. Douglas kept reading, and it hit hard. The village doesn't have the tech they need, so they'll have to lean on outsiders, and yeah, he might not find many good people like Douglas, but he'll still try to compromise. Douglas flashed a grin and kept reading, because it was Douglas who made Louis think about compromises, and Louis was genuinely grateful for it. Raffi shouted at Douglas, and Douglas snapped his eyes off his book and looked up. A rabbit-shaped cloud drifted across the sky, and Ravi leaned over, pointing at it like he'd just spotted something magical. Douglas and Ravi stared up at the sky in awe and kept moving, the apples from the elf village still snug in their bag. A chariot hitched to 2 horses barrels up a tiny hill, and behind it, row after row of mills stretches out as far as the eye can see. Douglas and Ravi rode through the streets in a chariot, Ravi staring ahead, Douglas grinning and lost in old memories, while the two raced to the town of Milton to sell the necklace that's driving Ravi's curse. The wagon kept rolling farther from the mills, and Douglas couldn't shake the thought that the road to Milton would take days, because they'd stop in towns along the way, then they'd ditch the wagon and march to Balzac. Douglas stared at Ravi, who just kept watching the windmills outside the window like they were calling him, and Douglas thought, "Let me show you how breathtaking the world can be." Douglas heard 2 passengers talking, snapped his head around, and saw them mention Alan, the hero in Balzac, talking about recruiting new team members. When Douglas realized they were discussing his name, fear hit him hard. Douglas couldn't forget the leader of the groups, Alan, and his crew. He was sure Alan left Balzac a few months back, but the crew was still sitting there like nothing happened. Douglas didn't buy the idea of recruiting fresh faces, because that team had always run with just the right minimum number of people. Douglas spun toward the passengers and demanded to hear everything they knew about Alan's group, but they shut him down fast, saying they'd already spilled it all and had nothing else to offer, and Douglas just flashed a smile and apologized for interrupting. Then the girl in the black cloak leaned in and demanded to know how much Douglas would pay to get the missing information. So Douglas blinked and told her to repeat it again. She yanked off her hood, rubbed it between her fingers, and smiled. "I'm a seamstress from Balzac," she said, "and I've got details that will hook Douglas hard, but you'll have to pay. And since you don't exactly look loaded, I can cut you a pretty sweet deal." Douglas froze in the hallway, staring at the girl, and realized he wasn't just curious. He was hungry for answers about his old comrades. One of the passengers leaned in and told her she was a magician from Milton, and that jab instantly crushed the girl's mood, while Douglas just shot up and stared with his mouth hanging open at the whole scene. The passengers started threatening the girl, snarling that if she kept stirring trouble for everyone, they'd turn her over to the military police. Yet she glared back with furious eyes and said nothing. Ravi stared at Douglas's back, then caught sight of him spinning around. He patted Ravi on the head and kept his apology rolling to the passengers nearby for the distraction, while Ravi's eyes followed as the girl rested her chin on her hand. and said Douglas was just trying to play the good guy. Douglas thrust out his hand and told her she could pick her poison, either a seamstress from Balzac or a magician from Milton. No big deal at all. Yet the girl scowled, then immediately looked away. She crossed her arms tight to her chest and unleashed a scream at Douglas. She had zero plans to keep talking once her secret was out. Douglas flicked his eyes away and flashed a smile, and as the carriage kept rolling, she shut her mouth and said nothing more. 5 days flew by, then Douglas and Robbie rolled into Milton and started sprinting from house to house in the heart of town, until a river finally came into view. Douglas slammed a map onto the table. There it was, a river carving the city into 3 brutal zones: the Old City, the upper-class 16th District on the left bank of the Lura River, and the last stretch called Bacchus Alley. With those gorgeous rooftops looming ahead, Douglas and Ravi rushed to Area 16 to find Morse, the guy who was meant to buy the necklace, only to discover he wasn't there. Douglas and Robbie got the word Morse would return in just 5 days, so they sprinted straight for Bacchus Alley. Douglas strolled beside Ravi and said he didn't mind waiting for Baron Morse for 5 whole days, and Ravi nodded right along, backing him up. Douglas and Ravi strode down the street as locals sipped drinks nearby, and Ravi cut in, saying she could wait because she didn't know who might buy that dark necklace. Then Douglas whipped his gaze toward her. Robbie flashed a grin and clutched her bag like it was a lifeline, then told Douglas she had a blast traveling with him and that she'd happily keep going. Douglas figured the longer the trip dragged on, the bigger the tab would get. Sure, it'd be smart to get back to the city fast so Robbie could finally settle for good, but maybe Douglas was just daydreaming. Then she caught Douglas's intentions and smiled. Then Douglas scooped up Ravi, told him, "All right, let's rest a bit," and explained that since Milton's such a huge city, they could hunt down all kinds of sweets. But before they could even settle, Douglas held Ravi close as a terrifying scream pulled Ravi and everyone else straight toward the chaos. Douglas let Ravi slide down and promised he'd scout what went down, then grab a spot to hide nearby, while a bunch of people loomed in that tight alley. That long-haired guy in the buttoned shirt stood there with his hands buried in his pockets, rings flashing on every finger. 3 men hovered over Ted, who was kneeling, and everyone knew his name was Ted. Then the guy in the shirt barked that Ted had to go get the girl. Ted lay on the ground, trembling with pure terror, swearing he couldn't bring the girl. His duty was to protect Princess Rose. The man in the shirt snapped in fury and ordered his escorts to beat him, and the men raised their sticks and swung at Ted. Douglas's furious shout cut through the air, "Stop, Teddy's already wounded." The moment the bandits hesitated, Douglas hurled himself between them and Teddy. Douglas kept a straight face and swore he had no idea what happened, but calling it out like that was too far. One attack and that was it. The sword-wielding man yanked Douglas by his jacket and screamed that he needed to stay out of this because Douglas could get hurt too. Douglas yanks the man's hand in the shirt, then hands Gil his clothes, and the madness hits. Gil snaps into shock and his hand starts trembling. Carlos clamps his teeth, staring at Douglas, who somehow keeps holding his hand with terrifying strength while his assistants shout for him. Carlos snaps, "Quiet," and Douglas yells his name back, sending Carlos into a sudden, sharp panic. Douglas stared at Carlos and demanded he let him go, but Carlos clenched his teeth in silence as his hand kept trembling. Douglas and Carlos' hands split apart. Carlos yanks his hand free, whirls away from Douglas, and snaps at the deputies that they need to get out of here. The deputies stare in total shock, then they obey. Douglas just watches them disappear. Carlos whips his hand up toward Douglas with a finger sign like, "I'm watching," and the bandits back off from Douglas and Teddy. Douglas rubs the back of his head, tells Robbie, "Come out, it's safe now," and Robbie peeks around the corner while Teddy, still on his knees, stares right back at him. Teddy tried to push himself up, but a sharp burst of pain made him fold over again. Douglas stared at him and demanded, "You okay?" And in his gut, he could already tell that Teddy's leg looked like it was broken. Douglas dropped to one knee, reached his hand toward Teddy, and fired off a healing spell. Teddy stared at his leg, then laughed because the pain was totally gone now. Douglas stared at Teddy and said he'd patched his broken leg with magic. But even after the body was healed, the mind hadn't caught up yet, so walking was still going to be rough for a while. Teddy stared at Douglas, fought to stand up, but crumpled to the ground, and Douglas and Ravi panicked for Teddy. Douglas shot his hand out toward Teddy and told him to hand over a cane, then promised he'd walk Teddy home. Teddy flashed a smile and thanked him. Douglas clutched Teddy in his arms as they trekked through the city streets, until they finally rolled up to the red light district of Macy. They stood before this huge gate, watching people stream in and out nonstop. Douglas stared in disbelief at the red light district, and when Teddy hooked one hand on Douglas' shoulder, he told him the spot where he works was right behind the gate. Douglas snapped his head toward Teddy and pressed him again. "So where do you work?" Teddy shrugged it off and said he worked at an entertainment venue. Teddy stared at Douglas, baffled, while Douglas shut his eyes and figured the place was probably closed. Only noon, after all, and Teddy nodded as Douglas convinced him to head to work. A longhouse lined the street, with outbuildings huddled nearby and trees standing guard in the yard, while laundry snapped and fluttered in the wind. Douglas and Teddy slipped into a room where a table and chairs waited. Douglas glanced around and muttered that it was way quieter than he'd expected. Then Teddy leaned on his shoulder and pointed out the outbuilding behind the main place, saying everyone was still asleep. Douglas helped Teddy sink into the chair, but he couldn't shake the feeling he was being way too careful. Because if a fight broke out here, it would spell trouble for Ravi, so they had to bolt out of this place immediately. A woman in dark clothes burst into the room and demanded why Teddy looked like that. What in the world happened? Teddy stared at her and said Douglas had shielded him from Carlos, and the woman immediately thanked Douglas. Douglas flashed a wave and told her not to worry, but the woman burst out that he couldn't just dump Douglas and leave. No way. They had to sit down and she'd treat them to cake. The second Ravi heard cake, he sprinted straight for the table. On the table sat a fancy tea set, a fork clinking with cutlery and a slice of cake calling out to be devoured, while Ravi tucked in with her fork, soaking up compliments about how she looked. Right behind Ravi and Douglas, both nursing tea and polishing off cake, stood the establishment's girls, buzzing about how Douglas had just saved Teddy. Douglas sipped his tea with a guilty little smile, caught off guard by how scandalously dressed they all were. The woman in black swore Douglas had just saved them from Carlos and his goons, because lately he'd been making their lives miserable, while Douglas kept right on sipping his tea. The woman slammed her hands on the table and offered Douglas a spot at their place, start as a bodyguard right away, and Douglas nearly choked on the shock of it. The woman kept insisting, stay on guard for 5 days, then you'll get paid big, and once we sort out a few things, those troublemakers won't be able to come back and mess with us again. Douglas replayed their plan to stay in the city for exactly 5 days, then snapped that he wasn't staying, he was on the move, and especially with a child. The women immediately pushed back, urging Douglas and Ravi to stick around for a while. Douglas stared at the women, completely stunned, because they closed in around him fast, and he figured that if he was alone, he could protect them, but with only these few days here, Ravi might catch sight of things she absolutely shouldn't. Douglas sat in his chair and snapped that he couldn't accept their offer, while the woman in black swallowed her pride and begged for forgiveness, because what she wanted was way too much. Ravi stared at Douglas, and behind her the women were whispering that they'd somehow made it this far, and this time they'd crack it. Ravi sank, defeated, while a plate of half-eaten cake sat on the table like a bad omen. Night swallowed the street as the house windows flickered to life and Ravi flopped onto the bed, glaring at Douglas, who was wiping things, to ask if he really wasn't going to help the people they'd met that day. Douglas clammed up and said nothing, and right then tears erupted down Ravi's face. Douglas froze, terrified by what he was seeing. Douglas shot up from his chair, panic slamming into him, because he had no clue why Ravi was sobbing, and she kept wailing like her heart was breaking. Horror twisted Douglas's face as he rushed in to calm her down. Ravi and Douglas sat side by side on the bed with a table, a chair, and a backpack nearby, and Ravi wiped her face with a towel while Douglas stared at her, feeling like she'd snap at him any second. Ravi tossed the towel onto her feet and Douglas just kept staring, haunted by the fact that he never helped anyone and that guilt burned him. Douglas pictured a man and a woman embracing by the houses, then tried to figure out how to tell Ravi, only to realize she'd never get it. He wasn't trying to be cruel, he was just terrified of letting her anywhere near an adult place that could taint her. Douglas stared at Ravi's tear-streaked face and worried that if he opened up the adult world to her, it would break her. He just wanted to show her all the beautiful things. Ravi shattered the silence and demanded to explain why he refused to help those people. He stared at Douglas as she waited for him to fire back, but Douglas just looked back and said nothing. Douglas lowered his head and thought, I can't lie my way out of this, and honestly that was just another annoying thing about adults, so he held back from telling Ravi the real reason he wouldn't help. Ravi caught his eyes, called out, and when Douglas perked up, it was game on. Ravi asked who Douglas wouldn't help, and Douglas stared her down and said, that's not true. Ravi pressed again, so why won't you help them? And Douglas shut his eyes. Douglas planted his feet on the floor while Ravi's feet dangled off the ground, not touching a thing. Douglas told him they were heading to an adult spot. Robbie stared clueless. Douglas snapped his arms shut and called it a bad place, and Robbie hung on every word. Douglas stared at Robbie and said, "Imagine someone you love squeezes you in a hug and your heart instantly feels warm." Robbie shot back, "That's me. I feel happy the moment you hold me." Douglas hesitated, caught between nerves and something deeper. Douglas shuffled the well-dressed crowd around and said, "Basically, if you spot someone like this, count your blessings. Most people never get the chance." Then he admitted how the lonely coped. Men paid women to play along and act affectionate. Yeah, it was an adult joint, straight up. Ravi stared at Douglas and asked if it was wrong to pay just to get someone's attention, and Douglas slapped a hand to his chest, saying people were really trying to plug their loneliness that way, and that didn't make it bad. Douglas snapped to Ravi and said, "Paying for love is heartbreaking," so he refused to let Ravi anywhere near that place. Ravi stared back and demanded, "Why won't you help us?" Douglas nodded in agreement, and Davy hung her head. Douglas stared at Ravi and said his heart might be in the right place, but that still wasn't an excuse to turn down people who needed help. Ravi braced her hands on her knees and said she'd been sad too at first when she was alone, until she finally met Douglas. Robbie spun around and stared at Douglas, blurting that she liked him more because he helps people, so she wanted him to help them no matter what. Douglas stared at Ravi and thought, adults should steer kids, and he remembered they'd already agreed on this. Ravi would weigh in before any decision or advice was handed out. Douglas glanced aside, flashed a grin, and immediately apologized to Ravi for how he'd acted. The next day, Ravi and Douglas marched up to an entertainment joint, and right outside, drunk, homeless people sprawled on the pavement, staring at them. Douglas couldn't stop wondering what Ravi would make of it, while Ravi just glanced around, soaking in the nice weather like it was nothing. Douglas leaned in and gently stroked her head, and when he lifted his gaze, he realized he'd been overthinking everything. Because Ravi could clearly see how she opened his eyes to the beauty of life, and how he should start looking at the world from a wider angle too. Douglas snapped his hand onto Ravi's shoulder as towering buildings loomed along the street, and he realized protecting the people he loved meant he needed a ton more patience, because the screams tearing through the middle of the road left Ravi and Douglas shaking with fear. A pack of armed men filled the street, Carlos and his crew, standing there like trouble just waiting to explode. They threatened Teddy flat on the ground right in front of the entertainment place's owner, and Carlos snapped that Princess Rose be dragged to him. The owner was in full panic as the other girls huddled behind her, while Carlos kept blasting threats at them. But then a long-haired girl stormed out of the building, furious about the noise. Rose stood in the doorway in a translucent dress, and the moment she spoke, saying they were making too much noise, the employees of the place went wide-eyed, stunned by her very appearance. Carlos strode up to Rose and told her today was the day she was his, no questions asked. Rose snapped back that if she came when he wanted, now he needed to get out of her sight. Carlos stood there stunned, like the words hit him in the chest. Rose slid up to him with a smile and told Carlos she had no time for him or his gang. Then Carlos's eyes ignited with rage. He snatched Rose by her clothes, yanked his arm back, and launched a storm of insults at her, but Rose didn't look away for a single second. Douglas suddenly pops up beside Carlos and Rose, shouting at Carlos to stop. Everyone freezes, shocked he's just appeared out of nowhere. Carlos keeps his hands up and snaps his gaze toward Douglas. A dark aura clung to Douglas and rage boiled in his veins, while Carlos and his henchmen trembled, terrified by his presence. The bandits trembled, clutching the memory of Douglas, and started whispering to each other, while Carlos snapped at them to shut up. Rage flared in Douglas's eyes, terror slammed into Carlos, and he and his henchmen bolted for the hills. Douglas and Robbie just watched as the bandits ran. Douglas swept Ravi into his arms, leaned in close, and apologized for showing up so late, then promised he'd love to take up the offer and become the entertainment establishment's bodyguard. The woman in black and the staff stared at Douglas with pure awe. Then Rose marched up to him and Ravi, walked right into the moment, and told them she was genuinely grateful to Douglas. Rose strode up to Douglas and offered her own help with a grateful bow, and Douglas just froze in shock, then flat out refused. Then a girl in a short dress burst into view with a shovel, sprinting and screaming that she'd save Princess Rose. She jolted the whole crowd away and barreled in behind Rose. The girl blinked, eyes blazing at the chaos, completely lost on where the bandits vanished to. Then Douglas and Rose froze when a stranger suddenly showed up out of nowhere. Both of them spun toward the dark-haired girl sitting on the ground, staring right back at them. A dark-haired girl in a dress and shoes squatted low. Douglas stood right in front of her, and he held Ravi in his arms. Then she jolted forward and pointed at Douglas, and in that split second their eyes locked like old ghosts because they'd met earlier on the stagecoach on the way to the city. The woman in black snapped in surprise when the dark-haired girl, Veronica, said she knew Douglas. Then Veronica threw her arms wide and grinned, "We're just getting to know each other," while Rose stood right there, watching every second. Veronica spun around hard, brows knit in fury. She yanked Douglas by the sleeve and demanded he step aside with her, while Roddy clung to Douglas's neck in pure panic, spooked right along with everyone else. Veronica grabbed Douglas's hand and yanked him down the street, dragging him to the other side. When she and the girls at the pleasure house finally looked up, they stared in shock as Veronica and Ravi split the moment, with Ravi planted beside Douglas while Veronica stood right opposite them. Veronica crossed her arms tight under her chest and warned that she'd never forgive Douglas and Ravi if they spilled what happened in that carriage. Douglas just stood there in silence, staring at her. Douglas demanded to know what Veronica meant, and she shot her arms in the air, rage blazing, heel slamming the ground as she screamed that she'd tried to trick Douglas and that it needed to stay a secret. Douglas shot his hand forward and told Veronica not to fret. He wasn't going to spill a word about what happened because he'd come to this city for a totally different reason. When Veronica demanded proof, Douglas blinked in shock. Veronica came charging at him, screaming that Douglas had to prove he'd never spill a word, because, in her eyes, there wasn't a single soul on earth she could trust. Douglas scratched his head, utterly baffled. Then Veronica grinned and told him she was ready to pay him for keeping quiet, and Douglas nearly choked on the shock of hearing those words. Veronica slammed Douglas into the wall, grabbed his clothes, and told him she'd be waiting for him at her place tonight, then warned him he'd better leave Ravi with someone. Ravi stood right there, cheeks blazing red, completely baffled by what was unfolding in front of her. Douglas shoved off the wall, lunged toward Ravi and cupped her face in his hand, then snapped that he wasn't here to preach, while calling out Veronica for acting way out of line. Veronica planted one hand against the wall and told him this was the very first time she'd ever met someone like him. Douglas forced Robbie's eyes shut as Veronica grabbed at her body, shrieking that she didn't know what she was touching, like a total child trapped in her own confusion. Douglas snapped at her to calm down, and the women standing nearby just laughed at the whole chaos unfolding. Douglas gripped Robbie's shoulder and promised he'd keep Veronica's secret. No cash, no deals. He refused the money flat out because he needed to honor that promise, and Veronica couldn't wrap her head around why. Veronica gripped her bag tight and snapped that Douglas was a hypocrite, acting like he was better than her. Douglas shot back that if Veronica paid hush money, they'd lock it in as a contract, not just an agreement, and without that payment, he'd still keep his promise. Douglas froze in shock as Veronica erupted in furious screams, swearing that if his words promised a contract, she'd be certain he'd never betray her, and then she shoved the money straight at him, teeth bared. Douglas snapped his gaze away and stared at the ground, thinking the contract still wasn't a promise of silence. He couldn't wrap his head around why Veronica was so relentless. Then she snapped her arm and slung the bag of money onto the ground, screaming like she meant it. The woman in black let out a shaky scream, and panic swallowed her whole. She had no clue why Veronica was acting like this. Veronica snapped her head toward the woman's scream, and there stood Douglas beside her, completely baffled. Veronica opened her mouth to speak, but something happened before she could get a word out. Rose stood beside the woman in black, locked eyes with Veronica, and snapped that she was acting like a child. Then Veronica's face flared red as embarrassment hit hard. Veronica trailed behind Rose as she announced that Douglas was their big-time guest, so he'd been hired as a bodyguard, and Veronica needed to quit fussing with him, and Veronica nodded along while Douglas just stood there, silent, staring out into the distance. The day dragged on, and Douglas and Ravi sat there at the table when a woman dressed in black slid up with tea, apologizing for Veronica's behavior, only for Douglas to wave it off and say there was no need at all. The woman set the teacups on the table and pressed, "Can we really count on Douglas?" Douglas shot back an apology. He'd refused to help yesterday. But the woman planted both hands on the table and snapped, "You don't need to apologize." She burst out that she still remembered Carlos and his crew, and that Carlos had started falling for Rose. Then he kept showing up to her every single day, determined to make her his. Douglas and Ravi leaned in at the table, staring at the woman like every word mattered. She kept going, saying Carlos was brutal to the girls, so they wouldn't let him near Rose, and that's why he started driving everyone crazy. The woman dropped her elbows to the table and buried her face in her hands. Douglas watched and figured he'd finally get to help these women. He leaned in and said he wanted a plan to shield them from Carlos, then his eyes met Ravi's as he spoke. The woman jerked upright in her chair and snapped that Carlos had started stirring up trouble near the place. Then the kids jumped in, pelted the house with trash, and the woman and Ted took to patrolling the area, only for Ted to come out hurt. The woman snatched the cup and Robbie watched her like a hawk. Then Douglas snapped, "Why don't you just stop chasing customers?" She snapped back that if they didn't fix it, they'd lose every client, and once the clients vanished, the money would disappear with them. Douglas stared at his wife, convinced he could only shield women for 4 days, because once he was gone, folks like Carlos could step in, and they'd never get that protection again. Douglas pressed a hand to his mouth, determined to find a way to protect these women. Then a handkerchief plummeted down from above onto the table, and both Douglas and the woman snapped their heads up in shock. Teddy accidentally dropped the handkerchief on the second floor. It sat there like a clue, then the woman spotted it, rage flared, and she snapped that her and Douglas had an important conversation going. Meanwhile, the handkerchief was right there on the table. Douglas snapped with an idea, and when the woman stared at him in shock, he blurted that if luring customers from outside was dangerous, then women could pull them in from within, right through the windows. The woman shot back that if the girls screamed from the windows, it wouldn't draw people in, it would scare visitors off and rattle everyone else. Douglas snatched the handkerchief off the table, tossed it away, and said, "You don't need to touch anyone to reel in clients." Then the woman's jaw hit the floor. She shot up from her chair and declared that clients should be hooked by the girl's secret, because that mystery would pull them right in. Ravi stared at the handkerchief on the table, stunned, then marched up to Douglas, only to find a flower cradled in her hands, and she proudly said she picked it for him. Douglas smiled and thanked her. On the table beside Douglas sat a box stuffed with sewing supplies, and Robbie was perched right there too, holding a bunch of flowers in her hands. She leaned in and asked what Douglas planned to do with that fabric sprawled on the table. Then Douglas snatched up the scissors and started cutting. Douglas stitched the fabric and molded it into a blooming flower. Then Ravi stared in awe as Douglas lifted the handmade blossom and held it right there in his hands. Douglas imagined girls tossing artificial flowers out their windows, then declared that those girls would finally grab everyone's attention. Ravi held a flower up, and the woman immediately approved. The woman stood beside Ravi and Douglas, then leaned in and said she could wake the girls to help out with the flowers. Douglas said there was no use waking them, those girls needed their rest, and he knew they could handle it on their own. She flashed a warm smile at Douglas and told him he was a good man, then said the whole pile of fabric was at his disposal. She climbed the stairs, hunting for more fabric she absolutely didn't need. Ravi stood beside her clutching a flower, and Douglas did too. Then he grabbed the fabric and said he had to make more folds so the flower would finally match the one Ravi had picked for him. Ravi grinned with the flower cradled in her hands when Douglas told her he needed her, so she immediately said yes. Douglas and Ravi snipped and pressed pieces of fabric together, whipping up a whole bunch of faux flowers, and they got so lost in it that they barely noticed anything else. Night had already swallowed the sky, and on the table before Douglas and Ravi sat a mountain of fabric flowers, so many they felt impossible to count. Douglas kept rubbing his aching shoulder like the fatigue had teeth, while Ravi beamed with pride at how the job turned out. Ravi called Douglas, grinned at him, and promised that flowers would rain from the sky and anyone who saw them would be thrilled. Douglas nodded along, right on board. The girls in their pajamas stood right on the stairs, staring at Douglas and Ravi like, "What are they up to?" Ravi got blindsided by their sudden appearance and with a jolt tossed some flowers up into the air. Douglas jabbed a finger at the flowers and the girls lit up on the spot. Then they hurriedly asked what to call him, and Douglas said, "I'm Douglas," before introducing Ravi too, and the moment the girls heard the story, they were left completely stunned. One of them blared that Douglas was a guardian and an adventurer, and that sent Douglas and Ravi into pure panic. Then Ravi scrambled right onto Douglas's lap, and the girl went on, shocked everyone, saying Douglas was famous. One of the girls slid a piece of paper to Douglas, and the moment he read it, his surprise hit hard, because he couldn't figure out what the writing was supposed to mean. Douglas stared at the paper, baffled that it could pull this much attention, and the girl shrugged like it was obvious. He'd beaten the dragon. Then a sleep-heavy Veronica stumbled into the room. The woman in black swore she knew Douglas was good, then dropped the bombshell that he'd fixed the problem at Matlock's shelter, and now she had girls from that same place working for her. Veronica went completely numb while Douglas stared at the girls in silence. Douglas tried to speak, but Veronica cut him off. She stood back and snapped that he was a hypocrite, proud of his own good deeds, her fury burning bright. The woman in black snapped with fury and barked at Veronica to shut up. Then all the girls stared at Veronica, shocked beyond words. Douglas stared at Veronica in disbelief, and when the tears spilled down her face, she screamed that she'd never thank him, because she couldn't let it look like he'd saved her. Veronica bolted out of the room. The girls lunged to stop her, and then, clap, someone smashed their hands together. Every face snapped around, shocked by where the sound came from. Rose was on the second floor when she heard Veronica snap at Douglas, and the sharpness in her voice made everyone freeze. Then she turned to Douglas and Ravi and demanded to know why the flowers were there, before ordering them out of the room. The next day rolled in, and Douglas, Ravi, and Rose were posted outside in the inner garden, Rose planting herself in front of Ravi and Douglas. "I'm sorry," she said, apologizing for what happened with Veronica yesterday, admitting she'd acted like a kid. Douglas stared at Rose as the tension hung in the air. Douglas stood face to face with Rose and demanded to know why Veronica was being sold through the Matlock orphanage, and Rose couldn't figure out why he cared so much. Douglas stared forward and told Rose he had to get the answer to his question. Then Rose planted herself in her heels and snapped that he was shouldering too much, trying to save everyone he ever met. Rose kept smiling a little as she said it. His attitude screams arrogance to her, but he's really just trying to help people in need, like a parent shielding their child. Douglas gapes at Rose in shock. She plants a hand on her waist and blurts that she's got a child too, one she had at just 15. Now she's 4 years old, and she's chowing down at dinner in the dining room with a bunch of kids. Rose stepped aside, snapped that Douglas couldn't possibly save everyone who needed help, and told him to stop sticking his nose into other people's business. Douglas sat with it for a second, then nodded and agreed. A gusty wind tore through the streets, and Douglas blurted that he couldn't turn a blind eye to people who were suffering, Robbie's hair whipping wildly as he kept going, insisting that if there was even the tiniest chance he could save someone, he had to grab it. Douglas cups a flower petal in his hands and studies it like it holds a secret. Then he tells you that's exactly why he became an adventurer. Rose pressed her hand to her cheek and gushed that Douglas was pure-hearted, and Douglas then shoved the petal to Robbie, grinning that he was just stubborn. Rose's smile vanished the moment she said it, just like Douglas had feared. Veronica wasn't just an orphan, she'd been sold off to Matlock Orphanage. It all kicked off when she was just 9, and now 6 years have flown by, with flower petals drifting down to the ground. Douglas' jaw hit the floor in pure shock as he stood over the table in front of Rose and blurted that Veronica was nothing but a 9-year-old kid. Yet Rose snapped back that Madame was respectable these days, even though the woman who ran the place before her was outright evil. Rose replayed the last few days in her head. Veronica was cowering in the stable beside a haystack, while someone crept around with a lantern in hand, hunting for her. The girl with the wild color in her hair loomed over Veronica, and Veronica couldn't move. Pure horror pinned her down as she realized, with terror, she was seeing this girl for the first time. The girl plopped down beside Veronica, suitcase gripped tight in her hands. Then she declared she was Veronica's new mentor, but Veronica was already hurt, and the girl quickly wrapped her wounded hand with a bandage. Veronica's mentor snapped a bow onto her hand and told her girls like her had nowhere to run. She'd better swallow the truth that this is where freedom starts, because if she wants out, she has to live here. The teacher pulled Veronica into a tight hug, and instant tears welled up in her eyes. Rose remembered Veronica's face shifting after a while. Then she told how he started hoarding money to break free, until 6 years later when the girls finally got a letter. Veronica stood among the other girls, eyes locked on the letter, and when she read it out loud, "Your detention was illegal." The tension snapped, and just like that, every one of them was free from that day on. Rose stared at Douglas and said, "When we heard the news, we were ecstatic." Then Veronica walked out, and after a while she returned, no longer drowning in debts, so Rose leaned in and demanded, "So what did you think, Douglas, and what exactly did Veronica come back with?" Veronica clutched a suitcase at the door, and when the other girls rushed up, she broke down in tears and said she had nowhere to go. Douglas went speechless with pure shock, clenched his fist, and realized he'd missed his shot by 6 whole years. Then Rose studied him with sharp, intriguing interest. Rose, Douglas, and Ravi huddled under a tree, and Rose blurted out that she was sorry. She shouldn't have shared that story at all, because it only piled more weight on Douglas's shoulders. Douglas snapped back that he felt obligated and he'd do it, because he was determined to help Veronica. Ravi stared at Douglas, then snapped that he had to talk to Veronica. Rose's eyes flew wide open. She clung to Veronica's words about kindness and helping others while Douglas and Ravi just stood there, frozen in place. Rose flashed a huge smile. Night swallowed the sky as Veronica perched on the rooftop, staring out at the nearby houses like every window held a secret. She still remembered her screams, the moment they promised she'd finally meet her real mother. Then the truth hit. She'd been tricked and she was trapped in a circle of laughing adults. Veronica jolted awake the moment someone yelled her name. She rose to her feet and there Douglas and Rafi. She spun around and snapped, "If Douglas is here to apologize, then forget it. I'm not apologizing." Douglas snapped back that wasn't why he was there. Right as Veronica shot up, whipped her hand into the air, and started screaming. She had no clue why he showed up, because having Douglas standing next to her lit a fire of rage in her, and her fist clenched tight. She shut her eyes and let out a blood-curdling scream. Douglas couldn't rescue her or the other victims, and it made her furious that the other adults wouldn't lift a finger either, as everyone kept reminding her of it. Ravi was terrified. As Veronica finished her words, Douglas shot forward in his seat. Veronica just stood there, stunned by what he was doing. Then he told her that he and the other adults had failed to save her and the other kids 6 years ago, and Veronica couldn't make sense of why Douglas was apologizing. Veronica leaned in just a bit and screamed that she already knew it all, then cried it was just a tantrum. So why was Douglas bowing his head? Douglas stared at the ground in silence, and the regret hit hard. If he'd been in Addington 6 years ago, he would have saved those kids, but he didn't. And the thought that innocent children were thrown into danger keeps stabbing his heart, so he begs for forgiveness. Veronica's cheeks flamed, her eyes glassing over with tears after Douglas admitted he was asking forgiveness for failing to save her that time. Then she broke down, stunned, because she couldn't figure out why he was apologizing. Veronica dropped her head, tears pouring down as she whispered that Douglas was talking like this now, but it was too late. Her life was already finished. Douglas shot back that he knew she still had plenty of chances left. Veronica wiped the tears from her face as Douglas kept pushing, saying the world was packed with chances. She could go anywhere, become whoever she wanted. She snapped back, asking if he was preaching to her again. Then Douglas leaned in and gently stroked her head. She snatched his hand, baffled by what he was up to, but Douglas only grinned and said he was trying to soothe her, while Ravi started doing the same for Veronica, and Veronica bristled, hating how everyone kept treating her like she was still just a kid. Veronica slipped her hands away and leaned into Douglas, saying she couldn't make sense of what was happening, because getting comforted like that was exactly the kind of thing that drove her crazy. Veronica broke down into bitter tears as she leaned on Douglas, and he soothed her by stroking her head. Night rolled in and the city's streets filled fast. Right then, a girl dressed as a cat hooked her arm through a man's hand and practically beckoned him over, and he just smiled back like he'd been waiting for this. Seconds later, a flower tumbles to the ground, and everyone nearby snaps their heads up in shock. Up on the balcony, the girls hurled stuff down at passersby and frantically waved their hands like they wanted the whole street to look. Everyone nearby gawked at the stunning spectacle, completely hooked. On one of the balconies, Princess Rose perched with flowers tucked in her hair, hands outstretched as she called to the clients. The men stared at Rose, utterly baffled, while Veronica stood beside the house, watching everyone nearby scramble to snatch up the flowers scattered across the ground. Veronica tilted her head as flowers rained down, and right beside her stood Douglas, Ravi, Madame, and Ted. Then the words Douglas said lit up in her mind. She could be free and go wherever she wanted. Veronica's lips curled into a smile, and it looked like trouble was about to start. Veronica kept staring at the drifting petals, then asked, "So, who do I want to become after all?" A few days later, Douglas just can't shake the feeling that wherever he goes, Veronica's watching him. Then the second he catches her, she freaks out, screams, and bolts. Douglas stared as Veronica bolted away, mystery hanging off her like smoke. Ravi stood beside him and jumped in to help clean up, and then Douglas washed the dishes, because it was his final day in that house. Douglas stood beside a furious madam, and he demanded to know why they'd hired him for such a tiny window. She snapped back that Baron Morse, the ringleader of those hooligans, was coming back tomorrow. The woman puffed on her pipe, fixed Douglas with a sharp stare, and warned that Baron Morse was already with his men, and that if she reported what Carlos had been doing, the Baron would punish him so he'd stop crawling back at them. Douglas snapped his head toward the madam, and suddenly it all clicked. Robbie hauled the washed dishes to Teddy, who was crouched low, while Douglas leaned in to Madame and told her that he and Robbie meant to hand the cursed things over to Baron Morse. The woman slammed the phone on the table and swore it wouldn't happen, even if he was a little eccentric. He wasn't worthless. Douglas' stomach dropped. He could feel it. Today was Carlo's one shot to make his move. Douglas and Ravi were out there with the girls, hanging laundry and trying to keep things light. Then Douglas suddenly realized, "Carlos, I haven't seen you since that day I met you at the house gate." Right as he finished that thought, boom, loud sounds ripped through the air and every single person snapped their heads toward the noise's source. Carlos barrels through the wooden door, smashing it to splinters that rain onto the floor, then storms inside where the laundry had been hanging, and Douglas and Robbie whipped their heads toward him. Carlos stared at Douglas and snapped that it had been days since they'd last met, then demanded Douglas bring Princess Rose. Douglas refused, and rage flared in Carlos the moment he heard it. Carlos flung his arms wide, and then those scary bandits burst up behind him. He snapped his head around and started yelling, demanding Douglas repeat his answer again. Carlos shot his hand up and claimed he hired Balzac's bandits, ones who could smash Douglas, so the girls cowering behind him screamed and bolted in pure terror. Douglas stared ahead and figured Carlos had gone extra quiet for days because he was waiting on reinforcements from Balzac, and right then, Douglas told the girls, "Pack up, go around back and bring Robbie with you." Douglas planted himself in front of the bandits and told them, if Carlos even likes Princess Rose, then back off, because grabbing a girl by force is the kind of victory no real man deserves. Carlos' face burned with embarrassment after hearing those words. Carlos's face flushed red. He snapped and shouted at Douglas to shut up, stop preaching to him, and Justice's father, Baron Morse, had done the exact same thing. Carlos barked orders at the bandits to take down Douglas, and right then, several of them snatched up weapons and charged straight for him. A heartbeat later, bandits crumpled one after another, hitting the ground hard as motion left their bodies. Douglas and Carlos stared at the bandits sprawled on the ground in disbelief. Then Carlos's legs gave out and he crumpled beside them, eyes wide, totally baffled as to how any of this was happening. Everyone swore Douglas had handled the bandits, yet he flat out denied it, pushing any blame away. Then his gaze snapped to a black silhouette on the roof, needle poised in both hands. A black-haired boy lounged on the roof, grinning as needles swirled in the air around his hand, and he leaned toward Douglas like, "Can you see my attack?" And Douglas's mouth dropped wide in shock. The young man clutched his chest, then leaped off the roof and landed a short distance from Douglas. He bragged that his attack moved so fast nobody could even catch it, and Douglas couldn't shake the feeling that this guy was pure danger. A creepy vibe clung to that young man, and Douglas instantly knew he wasn't like anyone he'd met before. With a smile that felt way too sharp, the guy said he'd cut straight to business. Bandits closed in on Douglas's back, and when they started to rip into him, he spun around in terror. Carlos just shouted for help, knowing Douglas was scared out of his mind. Bandits lay sprawled on the ground as a choking dark aura swallowed the air, and the stranger strode up to Douglas before snapping into a brutal swing. Douglas screamed that this guy had to be stopped right now. The kid hurls a spell into the air, and it rockets straight toward Douglas. Then a brutal gust rips through the crowd, shoving everyone back as the girls scramble to cover themselves. Douglas snapped the attack aside away from where the girls stood. The spell slammed into the wall, boom, and an explosion lit the room, and when Douglas finally looked back, he realized those games were soaked in poison magic. The young man rubbed his chin, blurting, "Why is Douglas hassling me? Aren't these bandits supposed to be my enemies?" Douglas kept staring, locked on the stranger, never once taking his eyes off him. Douglas squared up in a fighting stance, insisting, "That's not what's happening." Then the guy slapped his hand on his belt and sneered that Douglas was too soft, because wherever he went, he fought like he never meant to kill anyone. Douglas snapped to attention at what he heard, and the guy kept going, saying that if Douglas could handle anyone, he wouldn't lift a finger to save Fenrir. Douglas replayed the Fenrir fight in his head, stunned that this guy was still tailing him like he'd never lose. Douglas snapped to it right away. This stranger wasn't chasing him at all. Ravi was the real target. A creepy stranger loomed right in front of Douglas, and the moment hit him, this was really happening. He spun around and caught Ravi completely frozen, her fear locking her in place as she shook uncontrollably, tears of pure horror flooding her eyes. The stranger flung his arms wide and strode straight toward Douglas, saying it felt like Douglas was finally getting suspicious. Douglas stared back at him with a dead serious expression. The stranger's expression turned ruthless. He snarled that he was taking off with Ravi right now. Ravi snapped her hands to her chest, shaking with fear, and Douglas immediately shoved his hand over hers, saying he wouldn't hand her over. The stranger slammed on the brakes and Doug's instincts screamed. He didn't know who this guy was, but it was obvious he was Robbie's enemy. The stranger wore 2 swords in sheaths at his belt, raised his hands, and a grin spread across his face as he said that meant one thing: he'd go straight for Douglas first. Dark-haired grin spreading across his face, he stared down his opponents. Then poison magic surged in, and 3 sharp claws blinked into his hand. He swung at Douglas, but Douglas ducked and sprang back, then froze because he clocked what was really happening. The guy wasn't aiming at him at all. The needles whooshed through the air, carving past them and straight toward the crowd. Douglas shot his hand forward with razor focus, blasting wind magic to seize the flying needles. Then his flow swerved their path, yanking them off course in an instant. Then something snapped his attention. He spun around and found his comrades already crumpled on the ground, dead still, with their weapons dumped right beside them. Turns out his allies had been poisoned, so Douglas snapped and decided to unleash everything at once, casting detoxification magic to purge the danger. One of the girl's eyes cracked open and she tried to force words out, but all that came through was pure agony. Douglas instantly saw the poison was racing through her, and he knew it wouldn't be gone anytime soon at this rate. Suddenly, the dark-haired guy closed the distance to Douglas, grinning like he'd already solved the problem, because he knew he could juggle those skills all at once with ease. Douglas couldn't even tell when he'd closed the distance until the dark-haired man, still swinging, snapped that he'd hit his limit. And just as those words left his mouth, the punch crashed onto Douglas' head. The man flinched, stunned by what this guy had pulled off, and then it hit him. Those silent techniques and deadly physical traits screamed assassin. But for Douglas, this was the real trigger. He had to know why a monster like that would set his sights on Ravi, because that man didn't just act. He shielded the girl with his own body and took the danger head-on. His opponent demanded to know what he'd do next, and Douglas stared him down, wiping the blood off his mouth like it was nothing. Then the kid kicked his sword away and warned that if Douglas didn't stop one of the magics right now, he'd never get to strike again. If he interrupts, then the girls who make cash the wrong way and the hooligans are going to pay big time, because everyone crumpled on the ground is already out cold. Douglas lets loose his air magic again, blasting with wind, while the dark-haired guy sneers as if he's just pretending to play the guardian of that little girl. The enemy smirked like a villain and told the rabbit he loved seeing people fall apart when trouble hits. Then he promised to prove it himself and show him what the adult world is really like. Douglas swung with raw fury and snapped, "Shut up," because that wasn't what he wanted to show her. Yet the man's swing landed in empty air and the boy had already leapt back in time. He sprang into the air and yelled at Douglas, calling him an old man, then snapped that he was sick of not knowing if he could hit back with cold indifference. Right on cue, the guy pulled out his needles again. Blades started raining from the sky and it left Douglas completely baffled. Then the girls nearby burst into hiccups and trembled with terror, while the man still couldn't figure out what the heck had just happened. He knew that if he canceled the detox spell, Carlos and his crew would vanish, and then he'd have to blast air magic across the whole sky, so his opponent kept needling him, begging him to choose who he'd abandon. Douglas kept hammering on, and the guy demanded to know if he'd rescue those girls, the easy virtue hooligans, or Ravi. The second he finished talking, he was suddenly right behind Ravi and Douglas. The assassin already struck, then Douglas snapped into it instantly, spun on his opponent, and saw the blade was sitting right beside Ravi, making Ravi freeze with her mouth hanging open in shock. With a brutal impact, heavenly blades tore down from the sky, screaming as they fell. Then the assassin slammed straight into Douglas's side, blade already shifted to a new color, but Douglas didn't budge. Suddenly his expression shattered, then blood-streaked droplets splashed across his armor. A brutal gaping wound tore open his side and a clone was ripped right out of it, and Raffi thrust her hand forward, crying, "Daddy." Douglas flicked the assassin away with one brutal move, but the guy twisted out of it and popped into a clean backflip, landing solid on the ground. Then he smirked and said protecting someone by throwing his own body in the line of fire was boring to him. Even with injuries that should have ended him, Douglas kept fighting with air magic. Then a brutal gust slammed through, shrouding the assassin from their eyes, and the blade that was still buried in Douglas' side suddenly revealed itself again. Blood erupted from the man's mouth again, and Ravi sprinted straight to him, her panic screaming for her dad's life, tears pouring down as the blade tore him apart and she kept shouting his name. Her tears splashed onto her father's hand and he begged her to stop, because he needed to keep her smile safe, and Douglas couldn't stand the thought of the one person who mattered most to him getting hurt. And now he'd do anything to keep his promise. Lightning crackled in his hands, and he unleashed a brutal scream that totally threw his opponent off. Even after the assassin drove a knife straight into his gut, Douglas still somehow had enough energy to stare up at him and spit that he wasn't done. He had someone he had to protect. The guy cut him off mid-sentence, surged toward the man, and hissed that he'd just walk away, leaving Douglas without a heart. Then he kicked off the ground and sprang forward again. But he refused to quit. He kept pulling energy into his fists, finishing the sentence to push past every limit and crush whoever tried to stop him. Then he unleashed the power of the god of wrath, commanding lightning to strike. He demanded his rage be unleashed and snapped for the power of thunderclap to answer. Then the assassin went wide-eyed, stunned he could even cast another spell because he truly believed that was impossible. Douglas erupted in a blinding glow and shouted that he was activating triple skill use, then thrust his hand toward the ground, lightning magic, the kind that rips the air with thunder. The assassin got hurled into the air and dropped with a dull, soft thud, and Ravi knelt on the spot and called her dad again, while he wavered and begged her to stay exactly where she was. First, he had to purge the poison from his own body, so he blasted himself with detox magic, then snapped his hand toward his old opponent right away, and Douglas threw another wave of simultaneous skills. The assassin crumpled into silence, trapped under starlight magic, light shackles clamped tight. Then the boy jolted awake, grabbed him, and instantly decided, "I'll end you." Douglas snapped into the moment and realized the enemy had already clawed his way back to consciousness. So he warned, "I'll hand you straight to the military police." The assassin spit out the words, bitter and resentful, that it was already starting to worry him because his employer was going to be furious. The man scrambled to figure out who his employer was and why they were hunting Ravi, and Ravi snapped that he should have asked the rabbit. He stared at the little girl hiding a whole mountain of secrets, and Douglas' irritation flared. He wanted nothing to do with what this guy had to say. The girls barreled up to Ravi at once, but Douglas just flicked a look at them and decided to shut this whole conversation down for now. Douglas whipped around to face the girls and fired the words to Veronica and everyone else, because he had to make sure nobody got hurt. Then he begged for forgiveness and asked them to take care of Carlos and the others. She agreed. The assassin slumped on the ground and stared at his bound hands as lightning snapped across the scene, while the man beside him choked out an apology, because it was all his fault. Right then, the boy slipped his hands behind his back and Douglas went wide-eyed, not understanding what was happening, until the assassin suddenly started moving. Suddenly, the bracelet yanked off his wrists and Douglas just stared in stunned confusion, because the assassin had a knife tucked in his heel. Then his hands finally broke free, and right on the heels of that, he stumbled back and started saying his goodbyes to the man. The assassin, wearing that nasty grin, snapped that Douglas still owed him for his hands. The guy had already leapt onto the roof and vanished, leaving Douglas screaming for him to stop, until the man clutched his side, bleeding again. The man was seconds away from using his healing skill again when Ravi bolted toward her dad, screaming at him as panic gripped her. Pitch-black darkness swallowed everything. Then Douglas snapped his eyes open to find himself in a bed, while another bed loomed overhead and the whole room was terrifyingly empty. Douglas jolted upright in bed and froze. This wasn't just any room, it was the prostitute's house where him and Ravi were staying, and it felt like he'd been yanked here and dropped out of nowhere. Suddenly, Ravi burst out from behind the door, grinning as she called to him. Then the man snapped her name and instantly winced in agony. The girl pleaded with her father to stay still, warning that the doctor's stitches might rip if he moved. Douglas tried asking again, totally lost. Ravi tried to speak up about Dad's terrible wound, but everyone shut him down and said this town had no healer skilled enough to fix it. Then Douglas lifted his shirt and the stitching was right there. He figured it out fast. If you could mend brutal injuries just by stitching them together, then the heroes group could rake in money doing that. He slid his hand into her hair and whispered that he'd probably scared her. Then he leaned in to soothe her, telling her she was safe now, while he fully restored himself too. Right then, the man snapped that Robbie needed to watch the seam that vanished, and Douglas swore he already felt better, while the girl burst with real excitement, begging to know if it hurt. With a warm, honest smile, he said, "No, it doesn't," and then, just like that, the man's face flipped. Turns out the little girl burst into tears, pure relief flooding her face because he was finally better. Hail-like drops poured from her little eyes, and she kept repeating the same words again and again, like she couldn't stop. Douglas snapped Robbie's face toward him, wiped the salt tears off her cheeks, and begged her to stop crying. Then the door clicked open and a man stepped through. She heard voices and knew it. He'd finally come to his senses. A crowd surged outside the door, and the chief rep told Douglas, "You've been out for over a day." Douglas spun toward the woman. The woman cut him off and flashed back to yesterday, since her girls, Carlos, and all his friends were okay, and it was Douglas who made it happen. Meanwhile, the assassin was on the run from the military police, but it didn't look like they'd caught him yet. The guesthouse lady pressed on, saying the military police needed to grill Douglas about the dark man. Douglas snapped his eyes to her in shock, then demanded the question again. He told them they were dying to know who he was and what really happened during the attack. Turns out they wanted Douglas to spill everything he knew, and now they were posted outside, watching the house. She shot a quick apology, then promised she'd call them. Douglas cracked an awkward smile, realizing he knew basically nothing about the guy, just that he was an assassin, and that his target was Ravi. At that moment, the girl clutched her father's hand and started shaking violently. Ravi stood beside Douglas, thinking hard and waiting for him to talk. Douglas shot her a quick, guilty glance, then began to speak. He swallowed his pride, apologized, and admitted that even though the wound had closed, the whole ordeal left him wrecked. Then he said he'd check in with the military police tomorrow, and the guesthouse owner nodded in agreement. Suddenly, it clicked in her mind. She told him that once Baron Morse came back, he'd learned the truth about everything Carlos had done, and it stunned the man to the core. The lady leaned in and told him, "From this day on, you'll ride with the Baron on every trip." Then she smiled, because with his father watching him every second, he'd finally lose his chance to stir up trouble. The girl added that she'd even warned the Baron about Douglas coming to meet him, and the man just grinned, saying he'd now become her debtor. He was glad to hear it, but there was one problem: he couldn't meet Baron Morse at all. He spun toward Ravi and demanded she tell the military police everything about that man. Ravi blinked, completely baffled, and turned around. She still couldn't figure out what he wanted from her. Douglas insisted he never meant it like that, saying he only meant one thing: she shouldn't do it. The guy kept pushing for the point, basically telling her, "Just say straight out if you're against it, that's all I need." Ravi fell silent for a beat, then admitted she was terrified. Right then Douglas snapped, telling her to run for her life. She stared at him, confused as hell, unable to grasp what was even happening. Douglas promised he'd pen a letter to Madame and the others, so nobody got disturbed after they were gone. Meanwhile, Robbie should get ready, and Robbie listened as her father urged them to slip out of the military police's sight. A bunch of people loomed outside, and Douglas watched them from behind the door, scrambling to figure out a way to slip past the military police without getting spotted. Out of nowhere, a voice snapped from behind them, freezing the people who were seconds from leaving, and it ordered them to wait. It was Veronica, and she told them to stop acting so cold. The man stared at the girl, totally confused, and she blurted out that they'd arrived, right here, right nearby. Even so, the military police cracked up at him because he honestly believed they wouldn't spot them. Madame snapped her gaze to Douglas, insisting that maybe, just maybe, they should. A cart rolled up to the house, and right then the man who brings their alcohol and food every single evening climbed down. Madame had already quizzed the coachman, so he'd take them straight out to the edge of the city. Douglas warned her she'd get pulled into it next, but Madame cut in fast and told him, "Leave it with me." She reminded him Douglas was the guardian, so he should always pick the safest route. Then she pressed the point until Douglas nodded and agreed she was right. Ravi could have ended up in custody, but Douglas stepped in so the girls in the guest house can finally work in safety. Madame even added that they'd use the flowers he made with care, then urged them to look after themselves. Carlos thanked him for saving him that time, swearing he'd never forget their kindness. The girl said that was the first time she'd ever met someone as kind as him, and she begged to be allowed to thank him the next time they came. Right then, she said it was only natural. While the little girl tucked a flower behind her ear, Ravi reached out to straighten it and grinned, and the girl beamed right back. A stranger stepped up and told him he still didn't know if he even wanted to keep living, yet now he promised himself he'd finally take it seriously. He'd stop burning with anger over his past, face what's ahead, and find something worth doing. Veronica was the one who lit up with a smile and promised, "When that day finally comes, we'll meet again, and I'll stand proud knowing we didn't see each other for ages." Even the family riding in the cart cheered right along with her. Those few days with them had been nothing but smiles. Then the cheers followed them as people shouted, "Take care of yourselves." and they couldn't stop hoping they'd run into Douglas and Ravi again. The man and his daughter beamed at the house they just spent days packing into, then night swallowed the streets. They drove out of the city, and at last the boys hopped down from the cart. The cart rolled out of sight, and Douglas and Ravi kept pushing forward down those wide tree-lined roads, so deep into the night that all you could hear were the quiet footsteps of just the two of them. The man promised them things would finally be okay, then said their next stop would be Baltsek, because from here on out there would be no soft beds in sight, at least for a long while. The girl gave a sad nod. Beneath the moonlit canopy, the two kept heading down the path, Ravi's mind racing the whole way, until he finally admitted it to her and apologized to her father, knowing her fault had forced them to flee the city in a rush. She also brought up the dark man, and even though she knew she had to tell Douglas about him, fear slammed into her. She was too scared to speak, and Douglas kept thinking she should have forced herself to talk instead. Ravi snatched up her clothes and blurted out over and over that she wasn't dangerous, while warning that if her father stayed close, disaster would rain down on them. It all started because she was a cursed child, so the dark people dragged her into the world to use her as bait for demons, and the moment it hit, she broke down crying, her face flashing with a whole storm of feelings. Douglas kept repeating what she said about the cursed child, but he couldn't shake the feeling that dark people meant destroyers. The moment she started trembling, panic hit him hard, so he rushed to steady her, insisting everything was okay and that she needed to stop worrying. Ravi started to object, but the man cut her off and said he was thrilled she'd finally opened her heart to him, then made it clear he didn't want her to push herself to do it. Douglas told her to toss the guilt aside for keeping secrets and just wait. When he wanted to open up, he'd listen and take whatever she shared in return, and Ravi turned to her father with pure relief. She fell silent for a beat, then flashed a smile and said she agreed, thanking him, but the man could tell that grin was forced. The day they first met, Ravi told her she had nowhere left to go, so he grabbed that promise in his hands and swore he'd take her to Baltsak and find someone there who'd finally take care of her. Still, he couldn't shake the question, did Ravi really think she'd be watched when they hadn't even settled the exterminator incident yet? Douglas snapped his head toward the girl and told her she'd vanish as soon as he handed her off to someone, Balsak, leaving her staring in total shock, mouth hanging open. The man finally got it, this was really happening, and since Ravi wouldn't hurt a fly, he couldn't wrap his head around her pulling someone into this mess, or why she had to shoulder all of it right now, shaking with fear. He dropped his gaze, knelt right in front of her and apologized, then begged her to hear him out, to finally say what he'd always wanted to say, and it left the girl completely stunned. Douglas promised he'd hand Ravi off to someone once they reached Baltsak, then he snatched that plan back, because the truth is, he'd been wrestling with the decision the whole time. Long treks weren't fit for a little kid like her. She needed a calm city and kids her age to play with, and Douglas just knew she'd learn lessons he could never teach. And he kicked things off by declaring, "I'm just a middle-aged drifter," then shrugged that he had no clue how you're supposed to raise kids, and absolutely no idea what girls feel. He just wanted her to be happy, so he finally pushed the question, no, not for himself, but for Ravi to truly become part of his family, and when she opened her mouth, she absolutely caught everyone off guard. Her eyes snapped wide open, and she sucked in a huge breath, then stammered that if he stayed with her, her dad would get busted, but Douglas just told her he'd be fine. He just wanted to hear what Ravi, right from her own mouth, really wanted. Ravi yanked her clothes back, choking on deep, crushing sadness as she admitted she only wished she could stay with her father always. Douglas promised her no matter who the enemy was, he'd stand between her and danger, so she shouldn't stress at all. He'd make Ravi the happiest girl alive. Ravi burst into tears, spun toward her father again, and then launched herself into his arms for a tight, desperate hug. Douglas grinned and wrapped her up right back. That day, they finally became a real family, one journey closing its door while a brand new life kicked off for a middle-aged man and the daughter he loves, Ravi. That night, the path was already running out, so they held hands and beamed like they'd finally made it. Then they set their sights on the next city, the megalopolis Baltsak, while the wind kept roaring at their backs. Footsteps pounded ahead, and the moment Ravi spotted something on the ground, it started glowing like crazy. So he grinned, convinced it was ice. Then Douglas burst out laughing and snapped, "Yeah, no doubt, that's definitely ice." But still, it was a stone, white limestone, gleaming like a secret, and the girl snapped her mouth open in shock, The sheer beauty of that rock had her awestruck, and when they realized they were standing inside a cave, they both blurted out at the same time, "It's so beautiful in here." The man told us it's a limestone cave, carved from limestone that rain, groundwater, and other waters slowly grind away over time. Ravi said it again and again, shocked that the water had finally swept away a hole that big, and her father backed him up, saying it took countless long years for it to happen. She kept staring at the limestone rock, stunned by how incredible it looked, while Douglas watched her with a real, warm smile. Later, he pushed for a quick break right there, and even for some herbal tea from Theo's grandfather's shop, freshly bought. Ravi didn't just nod, he needed to hear that he was truly sure he wanted to go through with it. He nodded and said, "With Milton this far away, we don't have to rush anymore." Then boom, a brutal roar ripped through the cave and Douglas panicked, snapping his hands up to shield his daughter. He realized those weren't random stones, they were falling rocks, and he decided he had to peek at what was ahead, just in case, so he waved Ravi to follow him. She agreed instantly because fear was gripping her hard. Douglas shouted for light and a glowing orb flared up, blasting the ground with illumination. Then strange sounds crawled out of the darkness. Far off, a shadowy shape loomed, pulsing out eerie sounds, and then bam, a massive bird revealed itself, staring straight at the boys as it screeched again, still locked onto them. Douglas never thought he'd spot a tricolor garrow, an ultra-rare magical bird, and even in the dark, its beauty still lit up the night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something about it just looked off. Robbie spotted the bird's injury, jabbed a finger at something ahead, and right then the falling rocks roared, because he was about to heal her right now. Doug poured out full healing and the bird snapped its head up at once, then it pushed itself to its feet, while Doug kept his hand locked on it, healing it until it was fully restored. The bird suddenly burst into glowing brilliance, and Douglas and the other person stared hard as his jaw fell open, because it wasn't three colors at all, it was pure rainbow. The bird lifted its head, kept chiming out sounds, then shot into the air, blasting every rainbow color across the cave and lighting the whole place up like a spotlight. Douglas stared at the bird and swore it was unmatched, maybe even a brand new species that had hatched and evolved in this very cave, and Ravi exhaled in relief, thrilled that she was finally healthy again. She snapped her head to her father and said she felt the same thing she did back when he saved her. Douglas dropped into a squat, staring at his daughter as she watched that bird shrink into the sky, frozen in fascination. The man grinned because Robbie looked happier than ever. Hell, it had already been a month and a half since they'd met, meaning at least 4 months must have gone by since he left Baltzek. Before Douglas ever officially teamed up with Alon and the others, there was a stretch where he traveled with them first. Then he recalled telling them, "Before we leave, I've got something I need to ask you guys." He couldn't stop wondering what if a wild monster suddenly showed up right in front of them, but instead of attacking, it just stayed calm and peaceful. How would they react, and what would they do next? The crowd he was trying to reach just stared blankly, because in their world, there's no such thing as a peaceful monster. And one of them even misheard Douglas, thinking he was telling them to go easy on monsters. The last of the 4 boys snapped back, "If that's the case, you're wrong," because all 4 of them were ready to tear the monster down for the sake of the future. Ravi yanked him out of his thoughts by distracting him because she'd spotted a feather from a bird that had flown away. Now she was grinning, clutching that long, colorful feather in her hands and saying it felt like she'd thanked them. Douglas fell silent, mind racing. Tomorrow they'd hit Baltzak, and if they were still there, he could finally hand Alan this ring back, a painful reminder of his parents and the very spark that lit his curse. And honestly, he figured he'd never untangle his feelings, because he was certain they wouldn't be thrilled to see him come back. Douglas stared at his hand, one thing burned in his mind. Alan's ring, and even with that truth weighing on him, he pushed forward because he had to get it back to him. They rolled into the city and Douglas's brain just short-circuited. Street panels showed him and Robbie in their arms, and everywhere he looked, people wore masks stamped with his face like the whole place was reading his life like a script. Then he spotted Sweets sporting his own face too, voices erupted all around, and Douglas had no clue what the big deal was. Ravi laughed and called the cookies with her dad's face cute, and Douglas immediately told him to back off and not touch them. Suddenly, people's faces lit up as they recognized Douglas, and the whole crowd erupted yelling his name. No one had expected him to come back, but the townspeople finally poured out joyful cheers. "Douglas is back." Ravi panicked and leapt onto his father's neck while her father still had no clue what was going on. Then someone yelled that the strongest adventurer guardian was right here and demanded his thoughts, pointing at the title of his article. The man claimed he was a reporter from the Kashi Mashi Magic Printing House, and then he blared the word mirror like it was a command. He couldn't stop wondering how it all played out because his articles have the whole city buzzing. And tomorrow's front page of that suburban paper is about to reveal the return of the adventurer's strongest guardian, right there in black and white. He kept yelling, demanding to know what he thought, because the newspaper sales would soar again for sure, and Douglas stared at him in total shock while Ravi, perched on his arms, looked downright terrified. A reporter barked, "Tell me about your travels," and people snapped their heads toward the adventurer's daughter, because it clicked for them. She was the reason he had become her guardian. Then someone blurted, "No way, that light hair is insanely rare." Douglas started blurting apologies because his daughter was getting terrified, so he demanded everyone back and told them to give her space, while Robbie clung tighter and tighter to his shoulder, trying to disappear under all those staring faces. Fans kept yelling for his autograph, swearing they were his close friend, or that they'd once shared a table with him at a tavern like that was proof, and Douglas just couldn't believe how shameless they were. Everything was falling apart and he had to escape right now, so he leaned on his charm, trying to blur reality and leave the people in front of him totally baffled. He snapped his illusion, boom, smoke erupted around him, and Ravi's jaw dropped as he watched it swallow them head to toe until their figures vanished from everyone's sight. The crowd was totally clueless about what just happened. Then the smoke finally thinned and everyone froze, staring in shock because it was gone. Some people clued in that this was one of Douglas's tricks, and the moment they realized it, pure disbelief hit like a wave. They'd never seen anything like it before. The reporter kept going, insisting this had never happened before and that their legendary hero didn't just come back, he actually showed off his skills in front of everyone. Then he bragged that the newspaper kept a full record of everything that happened that day and that they'd sell it for just 2 copper coins. Right then, the reporter got knocked down and got trampled as they pushed through to find the adventurer with his daughter, desperate to make him perform even more, while the crowd screamed his name and fought to reach him faster. At the same time, out on the empty street, Ravi stretched his eyes for his father, then reached out into the air and spoke to him, and the moment he did, her father shot back, saying he'd used illusion skills to mask their bodies, so they bolted and escaped in an instant. He was convinced she couldn't spot him anymore, so he begged for forgiveness and asked her to hold out just a little longer. She agreed. And then, out on the empty street, you could suddenly hear heavy footsteps from people you couldn't see. He was crushed by what he'd done because he'd scared her, but she waved it off, saying she was fine, and honestly she was just happy her dad was famous. Douglas blinked in shock. Sure, he'd heard whispers about that newspaper story in Milton, but he never once imagined it would spiral into all of this. In the end, everyone in Baltsac was just stirring up chaos out of sheer curiosity, but it was going to get ugly if they didn't cool off, because he had no idea how they'd even survive the storm they were creating. Robbie blurted that they could disguise themselves, and when Douglas pushed for an answer, they bolted straight to the shop right as the same doorbell chimed, and the guy behind the counter greeted them with, "Welcome." But right then, the seller whipped her head around, searching for a customer, until Douglas and Ravi popped up in front of her and threw out apologies, saying they were here. The girl's eyes went wide with terror and she kept rocking in her chair. A loud crash ripped through the room as the salesman toppled off his chair, and Douglas shot his head over the counter to check if she was okay. Then the girl on the floor burst into laughter, saying she was thrilled to see him. She told him they hadn't crossed paths in ages, and her smile said everything. She was just relieved he was still alive. Lately, not a single day had passed without rumors swirling about him. Then she clocked the girl beside him and her mind instantly clicked. She must be his daughter. Rathai stepped in and introduced herself, beaming that it was a real pleasure to meet her, and the saleswoman shot back the exact same warm smile, pleased to meet her too. The same saleswoman dived straight into work, zeroing in on what he needed today. Douglas felt relieved. She pushed right past small talk, and when he said the truth, they needed a disguise, she snatched the curtains on the spot, getting it instantly without him having to explain another word. It all made sense. He couldn't even step down the street in peace anymore. She offered him hats and wigs, and in the next breath, Ravi jumped in and slid her father a mustache. Even the girl at the cash register looked up and said it was just so sweet of her. The girl with glasses said they had other stuff too, and when she offered Douglas a chance to try it on, he agreed without hesitation. Then he looked into the mirror and watched a totally different person stare back. a mustache, a wig, a hat, and a whole new outfit. The saleswoman grinned and said he looked amazing, like his wild musician grandfather. So Ravi swallowed hard and blurted that it wasn't his dad. Douglas stared at her with a pinch of sadness, then fell into his thoughts. The man spotted a few flasks on the table and demanded to know what they were, and the saleswoman grinned and said they were magic, tap one, and your hair color would flip for a full 24 hours. And yeah, bad news for him, they only have the one that flips to black, so using it is basically useless. She snapped to it right away, this could help Ravi. But she needed to know if he was truly sure he didn't want her dressed up or disguised, and Douglas shot back that he didn't want her to have to hide it all. He couldn't shake it, she'd been called out by name before, told she had gorgeous blonde hair, and he just refused to believe people would actually hunt a little girl like that. Ravi glanced at her hair, then snapped her eyes to her father, who locked onto her instantly. She told him that if she uses it, her hair will match his color exactly. Douglas's cheeks flared red and Lola snapped her hand over her mouth, mortified. The man spun to the saleswoman and said he'd take it. She thanked him in a rush. Then he leaned in, asking if she knew where Alan's group was, and the girl caught his drift instantly. The man shot that down right away. He hadn't tried reaching them to crawl back into the group. Lola burst into laughter and said he'd totally missed her point. She figured he just felt better knowing he didn't have to tangle with the hero's crew. After all, his smile looked like it could light up the whole world, until fate yanked them apart and they missed each other anyway. The group stayed in Baltsac until they vanished a few days ago, and right up to the very end, he fought to say the truth. She wanted to tell him that they were finally going to finish off the Demon King. Lola said it didn't look promising. Turns out the guild hasn't gotten a single request to take down the Demon King yet, and all anyone's whispering is that they broke in despair and were forced to scatter and run. Honestly, she felt a wave of relief the moment they were gone. Then Douglas grilled her again, stunned by her answer, and she confessed that they'd turned into the one constant source of all the bad news. Right after Douglas leaves, Dario from the hero's crew starts racking up debts left and right, turning everyone's goodwill into pure hatred while the merchants get stuck in a nightmare. And honestly, Dario can't believe his luck. He's shocked to find himself tangled up in money trouble. They've been taking requests non-stop lately, but they keep botching everything, and the supplies they burn through cost a fortune, so it snowballed into a brutal money crash for everyone. Lola said that was probably the spark for the fight, and the team was hanging by a thread, seconds from collapsing. Then Douglas gaped and shrieked because he straight up couldn't believe what he just heard. But the girl kept going, snapping that Dario was the one who caused it, acting like a leader while pushing only what benefited him, even forcing the whole team to shift gears and go all in on attack. She also heard Dario snap at Alan to throw Fanny out, because she's a healer, not a fighter, and she can't do a thing in an attack. Back when Alan was still just a part of the team, the rearguard held the wise Edmund and the healer Fanny, while Alan himself, the sorcerer, and the kamikaze swordsman Dario charged in the vanguard. Douglas admitted he'd definitely heard about Dario's claims against Fanny back then, yet the team still needed someone like him, and Lola snapped right back, he's right. But then Dario got blasted drunk and, fueled by pure rage, yelled that Fanny was useless, setting Alan off so hard he kicked him out on the spot. Dario didn't want to be chosen at all, so he clashed with Alan, and the whole thing exploded into a brutal, shouting fight, while Douglas just stood there stunned, repeating Fanny's words in disbelief. And it turns out the rumors they heard back in that carriage were pointing right at this. Because even after everyone teamed up to crush the Demon King, every group still needs one gentle soul to step in and settle the fights. Lola pushed on and snapped that they'd never brushed off something this important, not when even a smooth start would slowly sour into disaster, and Douglas couldn't help thinking about that good man. Lola's hunch hit harder when they brushed him off and Alan's crew started splintering on the spot, but Douglas didn't have a single worry. He thanked her, then sank right back into deep thought. Maybe that's true, but he still has zero clue about the curse, if that's even the reason. Right then, Ravi snapped out of it, grabbed her father's clothes, and panicked because she swore these people were hurting him. Ravi puffed her cheeks. Douglas burst into laughter. Then, once he finally caught his breath, he swung back to Lola because she just dropped a bombshell like everything had exploded. And Douglas wanted more juicy news beyond Dario, so Lola said there was about Alan. Douglas leaned in, hungry for answers, and the girl admitted the truth was buried under rumors, with everyone arguing what was real and what was fake. They swore he was sick or weak, and when the guy showed up his face looked drained, his eyes felt hollow, and there was no doubt he didn't look normal. The man grabbed onto her words and felt the world tip into darkness, convinced he was truly lost. Yet their last meeting proved he'd sensed nothing like this, and now he couldn't stop chasing what had happened to her in the last few months. But now the tavern bursts alive with night songs. Then the piglet night comes again, and the next day Douglas and Ravi sit at a table set for them as the man finally steps out from behind the counter, creaking the door wide. It was Achab, the innkeeper, who greeted him. Then he apologized for not showing up yesterday, and right there he seized the moment, popping in after a long stretch. Duckley spun to the innkeeper and begged forgiveness for barging in so abruptly, swearing he'd stay low-key and not cause a scene. Then Achab told him he could stay as long as he wanted. Back then, when Douglas shot to fame, shady so-called friends flooded the streets and turned the whole town into a mess, and yeah, he couldn't help but laugh at how they painted him. Right then, a voice from behind the door blared, "I'm home." And there stood Diana, Achab's daughter, waiting at the doorway. She beamed as she greeted Ravi, and then she lit up again as she greeted Diana right back. Achab's daughter peered at the storm outside and asked if it might finally quit by tomorrow, while Douglas' daughter just shrugged and wished it would, because she wanted clear skies either way. Behind the counter, the girls' fathers beamed with real smiles, and Achab heard about it. So he insisted he had to be happy now that he finally had a family to cherish, while Douglas happily agreed. Ravi is painfully shy with strangers, so he's been stressing non-stop about whether she'll click with Ahab's daughter. But little by little, she starts warming up and even seems ready to build real connections face to face. Douglas was seriously relieved Ravi had finally connected with someone her own age. Then they heard voices on the stairs, and Achab said the guests were coming down, so he told Diana to fetch her mom. She nodded and went. Douglas snapped that it was time for them to go too, then started disguising himself, ordering Ravi to grab that powder, while Achab stared in confusion at the weird outfit, and Diana burst out laughing. The dining room was packed, buzzing with everyone's own conversations, and right there stood Ravi, her hair as black as midnight, a gorgeous bow pinned at the top. She spun toward her father, and he couldn't help but wonder what on earth was happening. At dinner, Ravi blurted out, asking if they'd really leave for another city from here. Douglas paused mid-thought, because this was only temporary, and after all the non-stop traveling, it felt normal to her that they never truly stayed put. From here on out, he'll be living with Ravi, and they'll have to make the call, keep chasing the road, or finally settle into a real family life in the city. He just wants to hear straight from her what she truly wants. She had no idea what to say, so she finally snapped her gaze to her father, because he told her that if she kept traveling, she'd meet all kinds of people, uncover brand new things about the world, and that kind of spirit is what made her so captivating. But when you've got a home, you've got somewhere to fall back on, and that safety lets you live easy, worry-free. And there's Alan, the hero he keeps bringing up, because Alan has something he desperately needs, so he wants to hand it back himself, even if it means risking that he might never come back to this city, which is why he begs her to stay patient. Ravi nodded, and Douglas told her, "All right, use this time to think, then decide together what we'll do next," and Ravi agreed with a big, happy smile. Out of nowhere, a box slid in and grabbed Douglas and Ravi's attention. Then Diana shot out of it, snapped her gaze to Ravi, and told Achab's daughter to stop hiding and stay out of sight, because Douglas's daughter just couldn't figure out why she was there in the first place. Diana, perched under the box, told Ravi to go play the moment everything was cleared up tomorrow, then held her breath for his answer. Ravi hesitated, unsure if she really meant it, and Diana just smiled and agreed anyway. Rathai suddenly clocked what was going on and blurted out an apology to Diana, insisting it'd be better to stay home. Then Diana smiled and said, "Cool, then we'll play with dolls tomorrow." Diana waved, then ducked right back under the box, and Douglas with his daughter waved back too, while the man stared off in thought, trying to ask his daughter if she wanted to play with Diana outside, and Ravi immediately said yes. But then she remembered that this wasn't the first time danger had struck. She'd already survived that brutal fight with the assassin, so she snapped out of it, shoved the idea aside, and killed the thought. Douglas realized she was talking about that destroyer incident, and suddenly it all clicked. He could keep her safe and stop her from going out, but he couldn't just keep snooping into her life. He's done sitting around, he's finally got a chance to be friends with her, and now he wants to do something about it. Night falls, Robbie's already out cold, the tavern's still packed, and Achab slides a drink to a customer while avoiding her gaze. He stepped up to Douglas with a drink in hand, but Douglas waved him off, saying he was fine. Then it hit me, he was wrestling with something, and whatever it was definitely bothering him. Douglas shrugged and said it was nothing, but deep down he kept asking one thing: how could he safely kill time, even if the destroyer came for Robbie the moment he wasn't there to stop it? Ikov shot, mocking a taunting question about the destroyer, shrugging like his concern was just too much. Then Douglas went dead serious and stared straight at the table. All kinds of magical trinkets sat on that table, and Douglas immediately pictured the perfect setup, something to shield Ravi while he was gone, ideally, a way to snatch a cuckoo. Ikeb figured he'd found some magical anti-crime cuckoo, and Douglas shut him down fast. This thing would shriek a warning the moment danger showed up, drive it off instantly, and serve as the perfect magical shield for kids when their parents weren't around. Ikob snapped that he was going too far, that this wasn't about showboating, it was a protection device for the people who truly matter, and on top of that, it's so rare only a few craftsmen on Earth can build it. Then Douglas dropped the bombshell that there's exactly one place that knows how. The man was left reeling at what Douglas was about to pull. Douglas was headed straight for the Baltsac shop of magical instruments, the secret shop of magical instruments, and he promised, "I'll be back soon." Craftsmen forged magical tools as support items, and once adventurers wield them, they can unleash all kinds of powerful effects. Baltsac's shop of magical instruments is the place everyone talks about, famous across the country for selling gear so rare and flawless it feels unreal. Douglas trudged through the empty stretch, and the moment he reached the shop, he realized it didn't just open, it picked its people. 2 pillars stood ahead, really 2 towering totems. He dragged his hand across one, leaned in, and called out to the gatekeeper to wake up and face his challenge. Then a plume of smoke hissed up behind the gate. A voice suddenly burst out of the pillar, stunned to see the client show up that late. Because only certain warriors can step through his summoning gate, so the voice demanded he prove, right then, that he had the power. Douglas lounged there, calm as ever, and said the gatekeeper was weaving a one-of-a-kind magic spell. Only the people who cleared the trials he set up would earn the right to step into the shop. He remembered how last time legionnaire ants swarmed everywhere, and now a squad of golems was waiting to crush him. Only this time the gate snapped him awake. These weren't plain golems, they were a full 100 chunks of demonic minerals, tough even by unique mineral standards. If he was going to break out, it had to be right now, because the raw fist power from that kind of body wasn't even close to what an ordinary golem could throw down. Douglas stormed into the fight, thanked the gate for the warning, and leapt away from the stones already shattered by 100 golems. Then he snapped up a magical barrier. The gate snapped into focus as a magical barrier, warning that the golem's hits were only physical, so magic like that wouldn't touch them. Then, out of nowhere, a glowing shield crawled onto the pillars and the voice went silent, not understanding what just happened. They demanded to know what he was up to, but Douglas snapped back that the barrier wasn't shielding him, it was guarding the gate from his assault. Then the voice coming from the gate taunted, saying Douglas had watched closely, and right now, he'd figured it out, Douglas was the one standing there. He didn't even let the gate finish before shouting that his daughter was waiting, so he pushed himself to the limit, bursting out with fire magic and the salamander spell until the entire sky ignited, and Douglas's face lit up with pure, unshakable confidence. The man kept his hand locked in place, pouring fuel into the flames, and the fire surged into the golems, shattering them one by one. A thunderous roar ripped through the air, and the 100 golems crumpled into a pile of burned, smoking coals. Douglas sucked in a breath, exhaled, and said, "I did it." Then the voice from the gate snapped that he was an imp because it never crossed his mind anyone would beat his test that fast. Then the gate thanked him for sealing them in, and a bright glow ignited in the middle, bearing this store's emblem. On the other side, they couldn't believe who had blown through the challenge gate the fastest in history. If it was this easy, didn't that risk wrecking the store's good name? Douglas strode up, greeted the owner, and blurted out that it had been ages since they'd last seen each other. Then he stopped cold. Right there in front of him stood Esther and Carrie, the owners of Baltsac's magical instrument shop, and both of them looked stunned because it was Douglas. They all shook their heads in sync, stunned by how strong he was, and the girls started to doubt themselves, until they remembered it was Douglas so they could breathe again. Plus, they were convinced only idiots had been showing up lately, and they even figured he'd lost his card. Douglas swore he had it in hand, yet how would they even know it was expired? 3 years had passed. The girls shot into action, scrubbing the card's expiration date back into place. The card flared to life and Douglas snapped his gaze upward. Letters started crawling up from the card as he stared. This shop was pure magic and just looking was hypnotizing. Next time he'd bring Ravi because he was certain she'd love it too, and they handed him the card. Esther told him, next time just flash your card at the gate and you're in. Carrie figured he was there to renew his membership, or maybe to grab something real quick. Then Douglas shrugged and said he'd handle the shopping another day. He set out to find out whether they had any magical anti-crime cuckoos and what they cost, so the girls told him, "You'll have to order one, but we can get it," then warned him it was insanely expensive. 100 gold coins, enough to buy a whole mansion. Douglas had to take on those high-paying quests anyway, no other move. Still, protecting Ravi was worth it, even if the cost was small. He told the girls to book him, then said he'd return later and they'd handle everything. And now, right on that empty street, a lone figure finally shows up. Who in their right mind is racing to snatch those big, high-paying jobs that can kick off the very next day? Out of nowhere, someone popped up right in front of him, yelling about a massive blast tearing through the wastelands, and he couldn't stop wondering if he'd been sprinting for nothing. It was a worn-out reporter, but at last he'd found Douglas, the very mirror from Kahimashi's magical printing house. The reporter finally clicked that Douglas had slipped into Balzac's shop of magical instruments and even smashed straight through the summoning gate. The reporter had expected nothing less, but Douglas let his guard down because it was dead of night. Now was the moment. He seized it to finally spill the truth to her. He begged for forgiveness and demanded she stop chasing him, because with his build out in the open, he couldn't keep hiding from the townspeople anymore, and that was dragging him deeper into trouble. The reporter had no clue what he was saying, because he didn't even realize how special Douglas Ford was, one of a kind, and that's exactly why everyone loved him. Then the whole neighborhood snapped awake, threw open their windows, and stared when they finally saw Douglas. The reporter leaned in and asked for an exclusive interview. Say yes, and you'll see just how fiercely the whole town loves you. Then one day you'll be out there shaking hands, signing autographs, and riding the parade with everyone cheering behind you. Douglas stared at him, stunned, especially after the reporter brought up the parade. But then he pushed through and admitted that ever since that day, he'd asked to see the paper, and it finally showed up, drawing huge attention. Then Douglas shot out a quick, heartfelt apology. The reporter spun around, baffled, just as Douglas took off and yelled that he didn't want anything like that, and the reporter chased after him, begging, "Wait, or at least sign my autograph." Crowds burst out of their homes to catch a glimpse of the idol, but only one shadowy figure stared down at a torn scrap of newspaper. There was Douglas, close up, with a girl clutched in his arms. The next day hit and the streets stayed dead silent, empty, deserted, cold. From inside the tavern, one door slammed shut and then rapid footsteps thundered up the stairs, rushing off to something fast. Douglas and Ravi rolled up to the place, and the moment they showed up, the man told them they were right on time. Douglas muttered that he'd said he'd be here today, and the bearded guy just nodded like it was crystal clear he'd come. His ears stayed razor sharp, just like they always had, then and now. Ham was still the informant, and this time it was the dwarf feeding the intel. Douglas said Ham hadn't changed a bit since their old friendship. He makes his living selling secrets for cash and playing middleman on quests most guilds won't touch. And yeah, he's got intel nobody else has, plus the power to seize control of an entire country. Douglas pressed him about the business, and Ham said he was digging for answers, sure, but the brokering quests were trash right now because there just weren't enough adventurers to back special jobs. Ham clocked that Douglas was hunting a fat paycheck quest, and if he said yes, Ham had a few rough missions ready to shove his way. Douglas apologized and admitted he should have warned him up front. Douglas didn't care if the pay was small, he just wanted safe work. He refused to risk trouble again, so Ham figured there was nothing he could do about it, because now Douglas had someone he was determined to protect. But now it all changed. He dropped the pen mid-sentence and it kept scratching the page by itself, and when something finally snapped Ham's attention, he told the guy to hold up because a fresh assignment just landed. Robbie believed he was her dad heading to work, and Douglas shut that down with a grin. Yes, she'd be going with him, and depending on the assignment, they might have to leave Balzac for a few days, but they'd come back the second everything was done. Douglas told Robbie that he'd come back later to play with Diana, and the moment she heard it, joy lit up her face. She couldn't stop smiling, and Ham just sat there, grinning as he watched dad and daughter connect. Suddenly, he blurted that he had found the perfect one, but he couldn't even find the right words until he finally said the truth. No one could handle this quest except Douglas. The moment he said it, the man snapped and slammed a paper onto the table. Douglas heard a rich man's offer for a simple quest, 50 massive gold coins as the prize, and the payoff was so outrageous he couldn't just let it go. but the moment he thought about kidnapping, his gut screamed that this wasn't safe at all. Ham snapped that it wasn't a kidnapping at all. This whole mission was to track down a tycoon's daughter who'd bolted from home, and his story pinned it on Tolkien and his daughter Bridget, who vanished just a few days back. Bridget was 17, and this was her second breakout, because even Tolkien's secretary says the quest giver never stops clashing with someone. All that's left now is to track down his daughter, bring her back, and finish the quest. But if her trail stayed cold for days, Douglas would finally have a real patch to hunt, and Ham insisted she was somewhere near town. Douglas realized she could be right beside them and still vanish without a trace, and Ham fired back. That's exactly the point. Because it meant the guy's daughter had pulled in someone with illusion magic, and now everything was about to get a lot more complicated. Back in the city, he pulled off that crazy move, using the illusion skill to hide him and Ravi the same way the curse does, so he could mess with the cast spell and shut it down. And yeah, that's not just advanced, it's insane level technique. Ham said that's why finding his daughter was a death wish for any ordinary adventurer, so he spoke up fast before the job reached his hands, but a guild messenger grabbed the quest and got kicked out almost immediately. Douglas couldn't make sense of how it all went wrong. Ham swore he'd gotten lucky, found her, knocked her out, and carried her home, but Douglas's daughter woke up midway, bolted, and vanished on him. And boom, this magnate snapped at the adventurer and forced him to crawl through hell. After all, any father would lose it if his beloved daughter got hurt, so Ham jabbed a finger at Douglas and declared, "You're the best for this." Because hurting his daughter is off limits, and this job isn't about cruelty, it's about dragging her back home, and if he dares to take it, he starts with a toy berry. Ham will ready the ship, and now he has to dig up every last detail. Ravi couldn't wait to make sure they'd be sailing on the boat, and Douglas confirmed it, adding that the Toyberry was a tourist hotspot famous for its jaw-dropping beaches. If Douglas snagged any free time, he pushed Ravi to go swimming together since the heat had been brutal, and he promised it would feel amazing. Ravi lit up and agreed right away, while Ham just watched the two happy people and grinned. Ham said it was all settled right then. He'd call them, and told them the crew would leave tomorrow, and just as those words hit the air, a man dropped down from somewhere above like a bullet, crashed onto the floor, and freaked everyone in the room out. Douglas shot up from his seat, throwing himself in front of Ravi to shield him, because whoever had done this knew exactly where to strike. Even when they teamed up, every time Ravi got sent off to solo work, Douglas rushed here too. And when it was over, he didn't just get back to the city, he hunted down his powers and got them back. Douglas faced Dario, and Dario demanded that Ham hand him the same quest, then promised him easy cash on the spot. Turns out, Dario used to run with the heroes group, and he's a kamikaze swordsman too. On a pitch-black embankment, two shadowy figures lurked, and Dario perched on a rock, stunned when Douglas finally showed up. Douglas greeted him with a good morning and snapped that they had to hurry. At last, the men started down the embankment, and Ravi lay limp in Douglas's arms, fast asleep, while the man who stood there glanced at his old comrade and let a smile flicker across his face. Their conversation went nowhere fast. One bragged that it was cool now, and the other shrugged back like it probably always had been. The first kept pushing, trying to drag the truth out and figure out where the harbor was, but the second just stayed cold and indifferent, basically saying, "Yeah, that's why we're still walking." Douglas strode along with a forced smile, and the awkwardness clung to him, because this was too important to act as one tight group, so he'd barely gotten a moment to talk to anyone one-on-one. And yeah, maybe it's those rumors about Dario, because either way, he can't stand working with him, so this whole mission to find the runaway daughter better be the thing that finally makes everything right. He had to kick off the conversation pronto. He pressed Dario to talk and asked what happened lately, especially since he'd heard Dario walked out of the hero group, and the moment those words hit, Dario abruptly shut down. Douglas panicked that he'd said the wrong thing again, and Dario burst out laughing. He blurted that his delicate way of talking in awkward moments still hadn't improved a bit. Douglas flashed an awkward smile. Birds wheeled through the sky, then word hit Doug. He'd just gotten into a brutal fight with Alan, and Dario confirmed it, saying they kept getting wrecked even on quests with no Demon King involved, so he stormed off and quit the group. Douglas had to ask because he'd heard Dario was furious, like he didn't want to be exiled or something, so Dario snapped back. He never said any of it, and those rumors were nothing but dirty lies people swallowed on blind faith. Douglas shot out an instant apology. "But I needed to clear up another thing too, money and how to live." Dario admitted it was true, he was broke as hell. After all that, he finally grabs a brand new weapon, only for it to snap almost immediately. And ever since he ditched the group, every shop keeps hounding him for payment, and no matter what he does, he can't chalk it up on his account because he never brings it back. Dario said that's when he knew Douglas was in town, and that was the only luck that mattered, because the second Douglas's face shifted, you could feel everything changing. Still, Dario sounded calm as he spoke, like nothing was wrong, yet his words screamed pure hatred from the start. Then Dario finally spun around and snapped, "That's it." Douglas was totally thrown off. Dario explained that the hero crew was a special squad of chosen talents, and once you got in, you earned quest access, massive trust, and serious rewards. In his later years, the old man was so frail and pitiful you could barely look at him, and that's exactly why his "just retire" moment never came. Instead, he chased approval from the heroes like a man trying to keep them from moving forward. Dario was crushed to see Douglas, their old leader, fall apart like that, but then he was suddenly healthy again and the debts were gone, so she had no reason to despise him. Still, he caught her off guard with how openly he spoke. The boy snapped back that he was Edmund, the wise man, but he couldn't stop wondering why Edmund had turned weak, and Douglas hesitated, thinking whether he should spill the truth. But then it hit him, this secret had to come out. He squeezed Robbie in a tight hug and blurted the truth. Alan had cursed him. When Dario spun around, laughter erupted from him like a wild cannon. Dario's stomach twisted from non-stop laughter because the cold look Douglas wore was so brutal it left him stunned, like, what did I even do to deserve this? And even Douglas couldn't explain why he acted like that. Dario's eyes filled with tears as he wondered what the hell he was about to do, while Douglas looked totally stunned. Then the guy snapped that he shouldn't pretend to be clueless, because didn't he come back here just to smash everything and beat the living daylights out of Alan? Douglas didn't even try to agree with Dario, because he had zero intention of making any shady move, he just wanted to hand the ring back to him. Dario told him to drop it at the guild and walk away, and Douglas refused to give some nice answer on his own. Douglas mulled it over and finally said, "I just want to talk." He'd planned to grill him, why he did it and whether he's been holding a grudge, but he was honestly relieved he didn't run into Alan. He didn't think he should even show up, and then bam, Ravi jolted awake in his arms, stretched like she owned the moment, and Douglas blurted out, "Good morning," while she smiled and answered right back, staring at Dario, who looked seriously pissed. Ravi suddenly slammed with memories of every moment he shared with him, then stared at her father, confused and asking questions. Dario shrugged and said she looked like a doll. Douglas blinked in shock before blurting out that she was his charming daughter, and Dario couldn't help thinking that he'd gone dumb right alongside her. Right then, the calling started, half dragon, half human, pulling them in his direction because Ham had told him everything and he only needed to get them to Toy Berry. The man introduced himself as Vaigyo, captain of the ship, and Douglas nodded, saying, "Exactly, so now it's on you to keep all of us safe." Dario scowled and complained that it was a huge lizard. Douglas tried to soothe him, but then Ravi teased him too, so Dario started apologizing. Then the lizard cackled, said everything was totally fine, and brushed it off as baby talk. Vaigyo said they were finally free to go. The anchor yanked up and the ship lurched into motion. Ravi stared out at the sea, grinning like it was all a dream come true. As the sun climbed into the sky, Ravi beamed with arms stretched wide, and right behind her Douglas watched his daughter like he couldn't look away. The lizard snapped to it that this was her first time on the ship. The girl shot back, "Yep," and Vaigyo said she should be thrilled, until his mind flipped to one thing, food. Douglas insisted there was plenty to eat on board. But Agio shrugged it off. Toy Berry was only about half a day down the coast, and they could snag some fish along the way. Ravi suddenly realized he could net fish, and the lizard burst in, saying it's perfect for rivers, but not from that far, and told her to wait so she could watch it all with her own eyes. The lizard shot its tongue out of its mouth, and Ravi and Douglas froze in shock. Then it whipped its tongue into the sea, hooked fish one after another, and flung them aboard like a hunter on a mission. And now he figured it had to be enough. Ravi couldn't believe the sheer number of fish here, and Douglas was just as shocked by the whole technique. Vaigyo's grin snapped onto his face as he bragged that this was his one true specialty. Then he spun to Douglas, pointing out he could unleash magic since they could chew it raw and they had to wipe out the parasites. He also heard that perfect magic control burns you out, so if he really wanted, he could freeze the whole box. Douglas tried to test if it would work, and when the lizard spun around, it gaped in shock because it definitely didn't expect that. The fish got frozen up tight and the lizards were stunned. Douglas looked a little annoyed, saying he'd handled stuff like this before, and the lizard promised, "I'll defrost it now, just hold tight for a bit, and don't worry, I've even got seasoning for it." Vaigyo stomped out with a tray of fish, bragging that he'd already got it and insisting it had to look perfect, because that tray was packed with neatly cut, ready-to-serve pieces. Everyone was buzzing with excitement until Vaigyo hauled in raw fish and crushed their hopes. Dairio swore he'd never tasted anything like it. Robbie muttered that it couldn't possibly be edible, yet there was sauce sitting right there, and Douglas couldn't stop staring at it. The lizard insisted it was soy sauce made the same way you ferment grains, and then, boom, his older brother was out trading with an eastern country, selling it as a local dish like it belonged there all along. Robbie clocked the color as black, and Vaigyo figured they weren't into it, because if they liked it cooked, the lizard never got the chance to finish, since Dario snatched a piece and dunked it straight into the sauce. He popped it into his mouth and it totally stunned Douglas and Ravi. Then Dario's expression snapped, his eyes lighting up as he blurted that it was delicious, raving that the sweet and salty bite felt amazing, only for the lizard to grin and demand, "Kid, take more." Dario blurted, "I'm not a kid," while Ravi and Douglas stared at each other with forks dangling in their hands, grabbed a bite and tried it. Then the girl lit up and said, "This is so good," and her father tasted it and swore he'd never felt anything like it because it was delicious. The lizard bragged that he had more spices, including a wild green one, and when Dario warned it was spicy, the captain got the same message. It was way too early for kids. The sun was blazing so hard it felt like it was glued right above them. The ship sliced forward on the right course. Waves hammered the side, and Dario slumped against the hull, and the whole ship groaned and creaked like it couldn't take it anymore. Dario was furious with the pitching, because if it kept going, the ship could sink. Douglas lunged to stop him, but the lizard snapped back that the rocking was way too weird to ignore. Even with the wind and waves looking calm, Ravi still noticed something off, because the lizard didn't just have experience, it had 12 elder brothers. So he blurted out, "I've got 15 brothers and sisters, but why does the lizard have so many elders?" Then the lizard finally understood she was an only child. She had no clue what it felt like to grow up with a whole swarm of brothers and sisters. And yeah, that was a total headache. So right then, Ravi snapped up from his seat and grabbed her clothes. Douglas stared at her, baffled, like something had to be wrong. Then Ravi's face pinched with confusion as she started to tremble, and she insisted, "Nothing happened." The man stared at her like he didn't understand, but the lizard swore the girl was drunk and told her she could crash in the room below. Then, right out of nowhere, the ship erupted into chaos. The man couldn't make heads or tails of what was going on. Then one of the lizards barged to the captain and dropped the worst news. A giant squid had started tearing into the ship. His tentacles lunged for the Karma, but the lizards panicked and scattered up the deck. Then the squid rammed the side of the ship with those same tentacles, and Vaigyo's mouth flew open in shock and fury as he screamed, furious that the squid shattered his Prince of the Breeze. Douglas snapped to it. This wasn't a random beast at all, it was a kraken. And when he realized it was an S-rank monster, his shock hit hard, because you don't find that level of monster lurking in coastal waters like these. Douglas shrieked as he lunged for Dario, but Dario already bolted off, cackling at the top of his lungs, then launched straight toward the kraken. So fast it stunned Douglas, even quicker than the last time he'd seen him, like his legs didn't even need a boost. Right before the quest even started, Dario decided he'd get his fun in first. He swung magic weapons like the scattering blade and called down a meteor shower. The kraken roared as meteorites slammed into him at breakneck speed. A violent whirlwind spiraled from his blade, and then the weapon shattered into a shower of tiny pieces. Daria stared at his shattered sword like it had a heartbeat, then knew this was its breaking point. When he faced the kraken, the lizards behind him leaned in, expecting nothing less from a man who'd once stood in a heroic squad. Douglas stared at Dario's work in pure shock. Then the kraken jolted, plunged into the water, and somehow lost a handful of its tentacles as the ship battered the roaring waves. Ravi started swaying side to side, and everyone scrambled to stay steady, but they couldn't stop it. She crashed down, and Douglas instantly snapped into panic, rushing to check if she was okay. That girl's knee was scraped up and throbbing, but she wore a sad little face and insisted she was fine. Then Douglas glanced at her and fear hit him instantly. Dario was perched on the ship's bow when the sea detonated. Out of the depths, a kraken shot up, bellowing and roaring like the ocean had teeth. Dario lunged for his sword, only to realize it was snapped. Dario sprang back only for the kraken to get totally confused because he wasn't dodging at all. Something had slung him backward. Then he felt it, wind magic. That meant Douglas. Before he could even process it, Dario yelled at the guy, furious, because he had no clue what Douglas thought he was doing. But Douglas unleashed spells, and those wings of solitude shielded the frozen lands, while Daria stared at him, baffled. Yet Douglas just promised he'd handle it. Douglas burst into tears, swearing he was burning with rage, then unleashed Raxus's mightiest ice magic. The Ice Falcon, ordered it to freeze him, and watched it launch straight toward the Kraken. The bird swooped right up to the Kraken, and the moment it touched down, battle exploded. The Falcon's icy magic started to lock the Kraken in place, and its screams kept rising, louder and louder. A solid block of ice replaced the Kraken right where it stood, and every soul on that ship went wide-eyed at the sight, while the lizards erupted in joy, finally certain they were saved. Dario went wide-eyed at what Douglas just did because he remembered how Douglas handled even a regular monster, and the way he moved left him totally shaken, so a nervous little smile flickered across his face. A man loomed on the stairs while Douglas and Ravi sat in the cabin beside them, and the father knelt to treat his daughter's injured knee. He fired off his usual full healing, and Ravi's knee came out unscathed. No damage, no pain. Douglas rushed to apologize and promised he'd make sure she felt nothing else, and the girl backed him up, confirming she was totally fine. The cabin door creaked open, and Dario stumbled in, his face twisted with pure displeasure, telling them, "We're out in half an hour and the squid gets shipped on a different boat," then adding that once they calm the informant, they'll rake in a massive payday. Dario braced for an answer, itching to find out what kind of ice magic this was, because there was no way he could be stronger than he'd ever been in his prime, right? And come on, you don't see top-class magic every single day. Ravi kept asking about the top class, and every single time she heard Dario's answer, her mind reeled, while Dario himself just stood there stunned too, because she didn't even know something as basic as a skill rating. Basic magic is the foundation, real general skills, and the stuff that reshapes objects or boosts their power is first-class magic, while magic that brings life into the world is called high magic. And hey, full healing is a top-tier, high-class magic, and it looked like he could pull it off with ease, but it wasn't a move he'd bother using for simple scratches. Dario scoffed that even his worthless fanny couldn't stand him. Douglas snapped at him to stop, and Dario fired back that he only spoke his truth plain and hard, while Ravi watched, crushed and silent. Ravi whirled to her father and blurted that she wanted to learn magic too, eyes blazing with hope as she begged for his approval. Douglas stared at her, clearly uneasy and suspicious, and even though disappointment stung, he gave a sarcastic yes just to keep from upsetting her. Ravi's been practicing magic since Floria's days in the Elven Forest, and still nothing. He dropped into a squat beside her, staring at the problem like, what am I supposed to do to fix this? Ravi held her hands inches apart, and Douglas figured he finally had a shot to do something for her, so he tried every angle to figure out how they'd reach the city. But Ravi wouldn't budge, keeping that gap between her hands like a wall. Douglas stared at her with heartbreak, already plotting how he could help her, but Dario finally cut in, because the truth hit him. She can't use magic, so Ravi sank even deeper into sadness. Dario said it might just be that she didn't have the skill, but the guy smirked at her like he already won, and Ravi stepped in, determined to prove she really could do it. Douglas backed her up hard, insisting her talent couldn't possibly be under 5,000. While Dario shrugged and said that was plenty for the lower upper class, especially since the sage ranks were sitting at a minimum of 8,000. The man shrugged it off and told her to name her magic. Then she grinned and said she wanted to learn light magic. Dario pushed for answers. Why this magic? She'd already seen this old man's power, and she'd watched countless others too, yet she still picked the magic of light. But the first magic lit a real spark inside him. He demanded answers, asking why the magic of light hit so hard and whether she had any natural gift for it. She figured out the trick, and then learning it would take her no time at all. Dario stood there like her personal teacher, and Ravi sat on the bed listening hard but didn't say a word. Douglas stared at Dario in disbelief as the serious guy actually reached out to help, and he couldn't look away, because he still couldn't wrap his head around why someone like him would suddenly offer advice. Dario's stomach dropped when Douglas stared at him like that. Didn't he already know these things? Douglas snapped into panic and started apologizing right away, and Dario felt completely rattled just standing there, stunned and awkward under that intense gaze. Ravi beamed at him, and when he said Douglas just couldn't put his feelings into words, Ravi tried to speak up to her, but nothing came out. Ravi's voice cracked as she addressed the boy, "Big brother," and her curiosity wouldn't let go, so she went straight for the truth about what kind of magic he could learn first. Dario stared back, stunned and slightly confused. Douglas suddenly feared this could turn into a deadly lesson for his daughter, and he shot his hands up to stop Dario right away. Because he was the only hero in the group who couldn't use magic, so he had to step in and stop her. But Douglas's surprise hit hard. This stranger's answer flipped how he saw him, and the guy even admitted he'd already forgotten what magic was, smiling in this weird, unsettling way. Right then, Dario announced he was heading to bed, and later, he told Ravi that her daddy should teach her everything else. Meanwhile, Douglas watched the boy's behavior get more and more shocking, his mouth literally hanging open in surprise. He stormed to the door, yanked it open, demanded that whoever came to Toy Berry wake him up. Then, before anyone could even reply, he shot a thank you and slammed it shut. After that, he marched back to his cabin and left the father and daughter stranded together. Dario strode down the corridor, lost in thought. Then the guy planted his hands on his hips, bowed his head, and blocked the way, lit only by the glow of a single ship's lantern. Suddenly, the cabin door the boy had just slipped out of swung open, and Douglas peered from inside, smiling like he couldn't believe how great he was at taking care of people, leaving the boy completely stunned. Douglas admitted he had zero clue he even had that kind of side. And then OTA. Dario snapped that he did it purely for fun. Douglas just stared, totally lost, and after a beat, Douglas said he was glad for him because none of it made sense to him at all. He was ready to bolt, but Douglas kept yapping, yanking him back to that earlier talk where he'd stormed out, and he couldn't shake how badly he'd handled it. It felt like they'd just reminded him of whatever had flipped his mood in the first place. Daria stared at him like stone, said nothing, then he nudged his foot forward, and the guy burst out laughing. It hit him like a shock. He snapped his hand to his head, and the guy warned him not to dig into the past again because Alan would blow up if she did. Still, Douglas's patience crumbled fast and rage started boiling as he got irritated and angry. He snapped right away that there was no misunderstanding. Then the man's stuttering started to drive Dario up the wall, and he stared at him with a sharp, displeased look. Right after that heavy silence, the guy snapped that he wasn't the same blood as the Chibai, then double-downed by calling him an old man again and insisting he wasn't her relative. Douglas immediately felt heat flood his face. The man nodded, thrilled they finally looked like a real family now, but Dario snapped with disgust that he'd caught on already, while Douglas stared at her, totally baffled. Dario paused for a beat, then snapped out that he had one, just like he had a family, and no, they weren't related. 10 years back, when he was only 12, Dario got called to eat. A cheerful little boy nodded and agreed to go eat, because this was a village where only kids lived, and somehow, he'd grown up in one of those nameless places.